I am Rufus, 68 years old and a retired forensic auditor. My wife called me at work, her voice shaking with greed. She just inherited her uncle's multi-million-dollar estate, and her first act of wealth was ordering me to pack my bags and get out of her house. She thought she was discarding a useless, broke old man. She had no idea she was strapping herself to a financial nuclear bomb. When she came home, the divorce papers were already waiting on the table. I simply smiled, secured my real fortune, and told her, good luck. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to watch a greedy person walk blindly into their own trap. The sharp ring of my desk phone broke the absolute silence of my home office. I set down my pen, adjusted my reading glasses, and answered. It was Brenda. For 40 years, my wife had spoken to me with a grating layer of exhausted contempt. Today, her tone shifted completely. It held the breathless, intoxicating arrogance of a woman who firmly believed she had just ascended to royalty. "Rufus, you need to pack your things right now," she commanded. The words sliced through the line without a single ounce of hesitation. I just got off the phone with the probate lawyer in Atlanta. Uncle Garrison died last night. He left his entire estate to me. The manufacturing plants, the commercial real estate, the liquid assets. I am worth millions of dollars now. I want you out of my house before I get home at 5. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I felt the cold and familiar rhythm of absolute clarity settle deep into my bones. Brenda saw me as a quiet 68-year-old black man who wore faded suits and drove an old, sensible sedan. She saw a retired accountant living on a fixed income. She viewed my presence as a pathetic failure holding her back from the luxury she felt she inherently deserved. She did not see the truth. I replied with a steady voice, confirming I would be gone by 6 o'clock. "You better be," Brenda snapped. The lawyer confirmed the inheritance is separate property. "You are getting absolutely nothing from me. Do not try to fight this, Rufus. You do not have the money to take me to court." I assured her I had no intention of fighting her for a single dime. I hung up the phone and placed it neatly on the corner of my mahogany desk. The tedious time for quiet observation had officially ended today. Brenda had just handed me the perfect legal opportunity to sever myself entirely from her impending and absolute destruction. I pushed my wooden chair back and opened the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. I bypassed the stacks of standard household bills and retrieved a thick, heavily sealed dossier. During my long career as a forensic auditor, I learned that people constantly lie, but numbers always tell the brutal truth. I made it my personal business to know the exact financial realities of everyone connected to my family. I had quietly investigated Uncle Garrison's supposed empire 6 months ago when his health began to fail. I broke the seal on the dossier and spread the financial reports across my desk. Brenda believed she was inheriting a golden kingdom. The reality was a financial graveyard. The manufacturing plants in Georgia were bleeding cash, struggling under the weight of outdated machinery and severe mismanagement. The commercial real estate portfolio she was so eager to claim was leveraged against a series of predatory high-interest loans. Uncle Garrison had spent the last decade creating a maze of shell companies to hide his catastrophic failures. But the most dangerous item in the dossier was a confidential notice from the federal government. Uncle Garrison's estate was currently carrying a $3 million federal tax lien for deliberate corporate tax evasion. The government was preparing to seize every available asset to satisfy that massive debt. Brenda had not inherited wealth. She had just inherited a financial guillotine. If I stayed married to her, her blind greed would legally entangle me in this catastrophic mess. By demanding an immediate separation, she was willingly taking the entire burden onto her own shoulders. I picked up my cell phone and dialed the direct line to my private attorney, Robert. I instructed him to immediately finalize the divorce papers we had prepared months in advance. I told him to ensure the specific clause waiving all my rights to her future inheritances and subsequent debts was ironclad. Robert confirmed the documents were ready for my signature. I thanked him and ended the call. I gathered the damning financial reports, placed them carefully back into the thick dossier, and locked the heavy metal drawer. Brenda desperately wanted to be a millionaire. I was going to give her exactly what she asked for, letting her drown in the very wealth she valued far more than our 40 years of marriage. I walked out of my office and moved down the hallway toward the master bedroom. The large suburban house was meticulously decorated with expensive furniture and lavish artwork that Brenda had insisted on buying over the years to maintain a false image of upper-middle-class success. I ignored all of it. I pulled a single dark leather duffel bag from the top shelf of my spacious closet. I moved methodically, possessing absolutely no attachment to the physical space that had housed 4 decades of quiet resentment. I packed a few tailored suits, casual shirts, and my essential personal documents. I opened my wooden jewelry box and took only the vintage gold watch my grandfather had proudly passed down to me. I deliberately left behind the expensive diamond cufflinks Brenda had purchased for our anniversary using joint marital funds. I left behind the golf clubs, the electronics, and every single item that could legally be contested in a bitter divorce settlement. I wanted a clean surgical break from her toxic life. I walked into the attached bathroom and grabbed my leather shaving kit. I stared at my reflection in the wide vanity mirror. At 68, my hair was graying at the temples, but my posture remained perfectly straight. I did not look like a broken man being cast out into the cold street. I looked like a lifelong prisoner who had just found the master key to his own cell. I securely zipped the duffel bag closed and slung the heavy canvas strap over my right shoulder. I walked through the quiet living room, stopping briefly to place my shiny silver wedding band squarely in the center of the glass coffee table. It was the ultimate symbol of my permanent departure. I checked my watch. It was exactly 4:30. I knew Brenda would be rushing home, eager to assert her new dominance and claim the house as her exclusive domain. She would not be coming alone. Her sudden greed was a loud spectacle she always loved to share with a captive audience. I stood calmly by the large front window, watching the long driveway, fully prepared to face the impending storm. The loud roar of a luxury vehicle engine quickly broke the peaceful suburban quiet. Brenda had officially arrived. The final confrontation was about to begin, and I held every single winning card firmly in my pocket. The front door swung open with a violent crack against the wall, stopped before I even reached the hallway. Brenda marched in wearing a brand new designer coat she clearly purchased on credit just hours ago. Right behind her walked our son Derek and his wife Megan. They moved like predators closing in on a wounded animal. I stood there holding my single leather duffel bag. Brenda crossed her arms over her chest, her eyes blazing with an intoxicating, arrogant triumph. She demanded I leave the house keys on the counter immediately. She sneered that the probate lawyer confirmed the inheritance was separate property and I was getting absolutely nothing. Derek leaned against the doorframe with a mocking grin plastered across his face. He told me it was time to go because his mother was finally getting the life she deserved, warning me not to beg for a cut now. Megan stepped forward, her eyes scanning my meager duffel bag with overt disgust. She aggressively reminded Brenda they needed to inventory everything before listing the house for remodeling, making sure I did not take the good silverware. I looked at the three of them blocking my exit. I saw a wife corrupted by sudden greed, a lazy son eager to leech off a non-existent fortune, and a daughter-in-law calculating her own share of the spoils. They wanted me to feel utterly defeated, cast out of my own home with nothing but the clothes on my back. They expected me to argue, to plead for my share of the marital assets, or to demand a place to stay. They wanted the satisfaction of crushing me. I felt the heavy weight of my grandfather's vintage gold watch against my wrist. I maintained complete silence, letting their venom fill the air. Brenda took a step closer, holding out her manicured hand, demanding the keys one more time, insisting that this house and everything in it now belonged to her new empire. I did not hand her the keys. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a crisp white envelope. I handed it directly to Brenda. She frowned, snatching the envelope from my hand, demanding to know what trick I was trying to play. I stated clearly that those were divorce papers. I explained I had my attorney draft them last week and I had already signed my portion. I instructed her to turn to page 4. Brenda ripped the envelope open, pulling out the thick legal document. Derek and Megan leaned in instantly, their eyes widening as they scanned the legal jargon. I told Brenda to read Clause 7 out loud. Her voice faltered slightly at first, but she quickly recovered, reading the text with greedy anticipation. The clause stated that the husband, Rufus Hayes, hereby permanently waives any and all rights, claims, or interests in the separate property, current or future inheritances, and subsequent debts acquired by the wife, Brenda Hayes. I maintained a steady, unwavering gaze as I explained the exact terms of the agreement. I told her I was securing her millions. I reached into my pocket, retrieved a sleek silver pen, and held it out to her. I promised that if she signed it right now, I would walk out that door with exactly what I brought into this marriage. I assured her she would keep every single penny of Uncle Garrison's massive estate, and I would not fight her for a dime in court. Megan aggressively nudged Brenda's shoulder, her voice rising in pitch. She urged Brenda to sign the document, immediately pointing out that I was voluntarily giving up my spousal claim to the new fortune. Megan hissed that Brenda needed to do it, before I realized how much money I was actually leaving on the table. Derek chimed in, echoing his wife's frantic urgency, telling his mother that this was the easiest victory she could ever ask for. They were so blinded by the illusion of immense wealth that they completely ignored the single word that sealed their fate: debts. They only saw the word inheritance. They did not realize that by signing this waiver, Brenda was legally absorbing every hidden liability attached to that toxic estate. Brenda did not hesitate for another second. She snatched the silver pen from my hand with a fierce, possessive grip. She slapped the thick legal document down onto the smooth surface of the entryway console table. Her signature slashed across the bottom line with aggressive desperation, the ink pressing hard into the paper as she made her claim. She stood back, her chest heaving with triumphant pride, firmly believing she had just outsmarted me and successfully secured her financial independence. She handed the document back to me, an ugly smirk twisting her features. She called me a pathetic fool and told me to enjoy my miserable little pension, while she prepared to live like an absolute queen. I took the document from her hands, carefully inspecting the signature to ensure it was perfectly legible and legally binding in the eyes of the court. I folded the papers meticulously and secured them inside the secure side pocket of my leather duffel bag. The legal firewall was now completely established. Brenda was officially the sole owner of a crumbling corporate empire and a looming $3 million federal tax lien. I looked at Brenda, taking in the sheer arrogance radiating from her rigid posture. I looked at Derek, who was already eagerly discussing how they should divide the upcoming cash layout, completely dependent on a mother who was about to lose her entire livelihood. Finally, I looked at Megan, whose calculating eyes were busy appraising the living room furniture, completely unaware of the massive financial ruin speeding directly toward them. I picked up my heavy duffel bag and adjusted the sturdy strap over my shoulder. I walked calmly past them, stepping out onto the concrete front porch. The cool evening air felt incredibly refreshing against my skin after decades of breathing in that suffocating atmosphere. I turned around one last time to face the three architects of their own destruction. They stood closely together in the doorway, glaring at me with supreme entitlement, waiting eagerly for me to show a sliver of regret or defeat. I offered them a sharp, knowing smile. "Good luck," I said clearly. I turned my back on them and walked steadily down the driveway, leaving them locked inside a prison of their own making. I stepped off the concrete porch and inhaled the crisp evening air. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, severing 40 years of suffocating obligation. My polished leather shoes crunched softly against the paved driveway as I walked toward my parked sedan. I did not rush. I moved with the measured, deliberate pace of a man who had meticulously orchestrated every variable of this exact moment. I reached into my pocket for my keys, anticipating the quiet hum of the engine, when the front door burst open again with a violent slam against the exterior siding. Derek emerged onto the porch shortly after, leaning against the wooden railing to watch his wife execute their ruthless eviction. Megan came sprinting down the steps, her high heels clicking frantically against the concrete. Her face was flushed with greedy indignation. She marched directly into my path, effectively blocking my access to the driver's side door. She crossed her arms, adopting a stance of supreme, unearned authority. She loudly demanded that I hand over the car keys immediately. She pointed a manicured finger at the hood of the vehicle, insisting that the luxury sedan was a marital asset purchased during the marriage. She claimed that since Brenda was now the sole inheritor of the estate, and I had just signed a comprehensive waiver, everything on this property belonged exclusively to her mother-in-law. She ordered me to empty my pockets and walk to the nearest bus stop, threatening to dial the police and report a grand theft auto if I dared to open the car door. I looked at her flushed face, noting the sheer audacity radiating from her posture. She truly believed her signature on a piece of paper made her the undisputed master of my reality. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of intimidation. I simply reached into the inner breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket and withdrew a neatly folded, officially stamped document, fully preparing to dismantle her arrogant illusion piece by piece. I held the crisp document up in the fading sunlight, keeping it just out of her frantic reach. I instructed her to look closely at the bold black ink printed across the top of the official state form. It was the official vehicle registration card. I did not hand it to her. I held it firmly, forcing her to lean in and read the text with her own eyes. I demanded that she read the name of the registered owner aloud. Megan squinted, her arrogant sneer faltering for a fraction of a second as her eyes scanned the formal lettering. She huffed impatiently, rolling her eyes, and read the name Vanguard Holdings, LLC, aloud. Her voice held a mixture of confusion and sudden annoyance. She immediately demanded to know what that meant, accusing me of driving a rental car or trying to pull a desperate, pathetic scam. She insisted that Brenda had paid for this car from their joint checking account. I calmly corrected her assumption. I explained that Vanguard Holdings LLC was a private corporate entity. I further clarified that it was a highly secure holding company over which I possessed absolute and sole legal control. I detailed how I had purchased the vehicle under the corporate name 3 years ago, using my own independent capital, completely outside the legal boundaries of my marriage to Brenda. Therefore, the vehicle was never a marital asset. It was untouchable corporate property. I watched the realization slowly wash over Megan's face. The harsh truth cracked her confident facade. She had no legal right to this car. Brenda had no legal right to this car. Her threat to call the police was utterly meaningless. Derek pushed off the wooden porch railing and stomped down the driveway to join his wife. He scoffed loudly, calling me a liar and telling Megan to ignore my desperate games. He demanded I stop wasting their time and hand over the keys before he physically took them from my hands. I ignored his childish posturing entirely. I smoothly returned the registration document to my breast pocket and unlocked the car doors with a sharp chirp of the electronic key fob. I placed my hand on the door handle and looked directly into Megan's widening eyes, making sure she fully understood that my financial boundaries were absolute and completely impenetrable. Before sliding into the plush leather driver's seat, I turned my attention entirely to Derek. He stood there, puffing out his chest, utterly reliant on a false sense of superiority provided by his mother's sudden inheritance. I decided it was the perfect moment to sever his remaining lifeline. I lowered my voice to a dangerous, steady calm and suggested we discuss his own corporate assets. I instructed Derek to pull out his wallet and look at his shiny platinum credit card. I reminded him that he had been using that specific card to pay his monthly mortgage, his luxury car lease, and his lavish dinner tabs for the past 5 years. Derek smirked proudly, patting his back pocket, claiming that Brenda would just pay the bill now that she was a millionaire. I shattered that comfortable delusion immediately. I informed him that the platinum card was not a joint family account. It was a supplementary card issued directly under my primary corporate account. I stated with absolute precision that I had called the bank and permanently canceled his card exactly 10 minutes before I arrived at the house. Derek froze completely. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a pale, hollow look of sheer panic. He frantically dug into his pocket, pulling out his leather wallet and extracting the heavy metal card, as if looking at it would somehow change the reality. He began to stammer, his voice rising in pitch, as he yelled that his automatic mortgage payment was scheduled to process tomorrow morning. He demanded I reactivate the card instantly, threatening that he would lose his house if the payment bounced. I looked at my 34-year-old son and felt absolutely no pity. I replied that his mortgage was now a problem for him and his calculating wife to solve together. I advised him to start acting like a grown man instead of a parasite. I slid into the driver's seat, pulled the door shut, and ignited the engine. The powerful motor roared to life. I shifted the car into gear and drove smoothly down the street. In my rearview mirror, I watched Derek frantically dialing his phone while Megan screamed at him in the middle of the driveway. I had initiated the collapse of their fragile world, and I left them there to drown in the consequences. As I navigated the sedan onto the interstate, my phone began buzzing aggressively in the passenger seat. I had legally placed digital tripwires on Brenda and Derek's financial profiles years ago to prevent them from destroying my credit. I pulled into a quiet parking lot to review the incoming data. Brenda was wasting absolutely no time. She had already posted a public video on her social media holding a cheap glass of champagne in the living room I had just vacated. Derek and Megan were cheering loudly in the background, toasting to their new supposed empire. They were completely convinced they were untouchable royalty. Within an hour of my departure, Brenda initiated a rapid succession of reckless financial moves. My tracking software alerted me to multiple hard inquiries on her credit report. She submitted an aggressive application for a massive bridge loan at a high-interest commercial bank. She used Uncle Garrison's bloated, fraudulent property appraisals as direct collateral to secure the cash. Derek, desperate to cover the exorbitant mortgage I had just cut off, instantly piggybacked on her application. He requested a secondary line of credit, citing his mother's impending estate liquidation as guaranteed income. They were actively borrowing hundreds of thousands of dollars of phantom money. The sheer velocity of their greed was breathtaking to witness. They did not wait for a single piece of probate paperwork to clear the courts. They did not consult a legitimate financial advisor or review the estate ledgers. They simply saw a mirage of millions and immediately chained themselves to predatory lenders who would aggressively collect the moment the ink dried. Every single application they submitted dug their grave significantly deeper. They were legally binding themselves to exorbitant interest rates based entirely on a manufacturing estate that the federal government was already preparing to dismantle. I put my car back in drive, leaving them to their foolish celebration. I pulled my sedan into the highly secure private underground parking garage of the most exclusive high-rise in the downtown financial district. A biometric scanner verified my retina and instantly granted me access to the private elevator. The heavy steel doors opened directly into my actual residence, a sweeping 4,000 square foot luxury penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering city skyline. This was the fortress I had purchased in cash 5 years ago under a different corporate umbrella, completely hidden from my family's greedy eyes. I dropped my leather duffel bag onto the imported marble floor and walked straight into my dedicated command center. 3 large curved monitors woke up instantly as I swiped my encrypted access card. The screens illuminated the dark, quiet room with real-time data streams. As a forensic auditor, I never left any detail to chance. I pulled up the exact tracking software that monitored Vanguard Holdings and my various massive investment portfolios. I also accessed the credit monitoring alerts I had established for my soon-to-be ex-wife and my parasitic son. The screens flashed bright red with every new inquiry Brenda and Derek generated. I watched the digital footprint of their utter stupidity multiply in real time. Brenda was applying for platinum-tier credit cards, luxury vehicle financing, and an enormous personal loan to fund a lavish shopping spree. She was behaving exactly like a lottery winner who had completely lost her grip on reality. I sat down in my ergonomic leather chair, poured myself a glass of sparkling water, and observed the systematic suicide of her financial future. The interest rates they were accepting were financial suicide locking, in terms that would bankrupt a healthy company, let alone a dead one. Their arrogance blinded them to the fine print. I simply watched the inevitable disaster take shape. The dark, serene skyline behind my monitors stood in sharp contrast to the chaotic collapse happening in the suburbs. I had spent decades hiding my brilliance and suppressing my wealth just to keep the peace in a house that offered me nothing but disrespect. Now, sitting in the absolute luxury I had earned through ruthless precision and endless patience, I felt the heavy chains of my false life shatter completely. I did not feel a single drop of guilt. The sleek console on my mahogany desk chimed sharply, signaling an incoming encrypted call. I pressed the flashing green button, allowing the audio to fill the spacious room. It was Robert, my private attorney. His voice came through the speakers crisp, commanding, and devoid of any unnecessary emotion. He informed me that his expedited courier had successfully delivered the signed documents to the presiding judge at the family court just minutes before the filing deadline. Because we had meticulously prepared the documents in advance, and Brenda had provided an aggressive, uncontested signature on the waiver, the preliminary separation decree was legally cemented. Robert explicitly confirmed that Clause 7 was fully activated and recognized by the court. I was officially insulated from any and all liabilities connected to Uncle Garrison's catastrophic estate. Brenda was now flying completely solo into a hurricane. Robert informed me that his contacts confirmed the federal tax agents were already maneuvering to freeze Garrison's business accounts by the end of the week. It was only a matter of days before the Internal Revenue Service turned their aggressive focus directly onto Brenda, the sole legal heir of the fraudulent empire. I thanked Robert for his flawless execution and immediately authorized his premium bonus payment for handling the matter with such precision. I ended the call and leaned back in my chair, staring out at the glowing city lights reflecting off the glass. The trap was officially locked. There was absolutely no legal loophole, no hidden back door, and no amount of crying that could save Brenda from the incoming federal hammer. She had gleefully signed away her right to my protection in exchange for a mountain of toxic debt. Derek and Megan had cheered her on, effectively throwing themselves onto the exact same sinking ship. I closed the financial monitoring dashboard and shut down the glowing monitors bathing the penthouse in quiet, peaceful moonlight. The intense, draining conflict of my previous life was permanently replaced by the cold, beautiful mechanics of ultimate justice. I had given them exactly what they demanded without a single argument. Now they were going to have to survive the devastating consequences of their own actions. The ambient string quartet music floating through the elite downtown steakhouse provided the perfect soundtrack for Derek and Megan's delusion. They sat at a prime center table surrounded by a group of their equally pretentious friends, loudly celebrating their sudden elevation to the millionaire class. Derek ordered a massive seafood tower and 2 bottles of vintage champagne, aggressively waving away the waiter when he attempted to hand him the wine list. Megan sat beside him, flashing a diamond tennis bracelet and openly bragging about the massive renovations she planned to make to the suburban house they had just stolen from me. The table roared with laughter, toasting to Brenda's newfound empire and mocking my quiet departure. 2 hours later, the empty plates were cleared, and the waiter presented the leather check presenter. The bill exceeded $4,000. Derek casually tossed the heavy platinum credit card onto the small silver tray without even glancing at the total. He leaned back, soaking in the admiration of his peers. 10 minutes passed. The waiter returned, but his professional smile was completely gone. He leaned down, keeping his voice discreet but firm, and informed Derek that the card had been declined. Derek scoffed, snatching the card and aggressively telling the waiter to run it again, claiming there had to be a machine error. The waiter stood his ground. He stated clearly, loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear, that the issuer had permanently frozen the account. The laughter at the table died instantly. Megan's face drained of color as the surrounding patrons began to stare. Derek furiously dug into his wallet and produced 3 other credit cards. The waiter patiently ran each one. Every single card bounced back declined, maxed out by the reckless spending spree Brenda had initiated earlier that afternoon. The restaurant manager approached the table, flanked by 2 security guards, politely but firmly demanding a valid form of payment. Derek was publicly stripped of his fake crown, humiliated in front of the exact high society crowd he so desperately wanted to impress. I was standing on the expansive balcony of my penthouse, holding a glass of aged bourbon, when my private cell phone vibrated violently against the glass railing. I glanced at the screen and saw Derek's name flashing. I swiped to answer and pressed the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I simply listened to the chaotic background noise of the restaurant lobby and the sound of my son hyperventilating. Derek exploded through the speaker, his voice a frantic mixture of rage and sheer panic. He screamed that I was a petty, bitter old man trying to ruin his life because I was jealous of his mother's new fortune. He demanded I immediately call the bank and authorize the $4,000 transaction, threatening to call the police and accuse me of financial abuse if I refused. He shouted that his friends were watching him, that the restaurant manager was threatening to call the authorities for theft of services, and that Megan was crying in the restroom. He arrogantly reminded me that Brenda would be receiving her millions by the end of the week, and he promised to pay me back every single dime just as soon as the probate cleared. He swore that if I left him stranded at this restaurant, he would make sure I never saw him or any future grandchildren ever again. He threw every emotional manipulation tactic he had ever learned directly at me, expecting me to cave to the pressure just as I always had in the past, to keep the peace. I stood perfectly still, letting the cool night wind brush against my face. I let him scream until his voice grew hoarse. I let him exhaust all his empty threats. I did not interrupt him. I waited for the absolute silence to stretch between us, ensuring he could hear the steady, unbothered rhythm of my breathing. I finally spoke, my voice cold, precise, and completely devoid of paternal affection. I told him he was no longer speaking to his silent, compliant father. I was speaking to the man who actually owned his entire existence. I walked back into my command center, leaving the balcony doors open. I pulled up my master financial ledger on the center monitor. I informed Derek that he had exactly 2 minutes before the restaurant manager called the police, and I advised him to listen very carefully. I methodically read the cold, hard numbers directly from the screen. I stated that over the past 5 years, I had secretly transferred exactly $86,420 to cover his perpetually delinquent mortgage. I listed the $22,000 I had paid to guarantee the lease on Megan's luxury SUV. I recited the precise dates I had bailed out his maxed-out credit cards, totaling $47,000 of reckless debt. I dismantled his entire illusion of self, made success dollar by dollar. I told him he was a 34-year-old financial infant who had survived solely because I chose to subsidize his arrogant lifestyle. Derek fell completely silent on the other end of the line, the crushing weight of reality finally piercing his delusion. He weakly stammered, asking how he was supposed to pay the restaurant bill right now. I replied that he should ask his newly rich mother for a bailout, though I highly doubted her newly acquired $3 million federal tax lien would leave any room in her budget for overpriced champagne. Derek gasped, asking what tax lien I was talking about. I did not explain. I told him the invisible safety net was permanently severed. I advised him to hand his expensive watch to the restaurant manager as collateral and figure out how to walk home. I ended the call and blocked his number. The connection severed with a sharp final click. I deleted his contact profile from my phone, pouring the remainder of my bourbon down the sink. Derek and Megan were currently stranded downtown, facing the immediate legal consequences of their unearned extravagance. They would soon return to a house burdened by a mortgage they could no longer pay, clinging to a mother who was rapidly accelerating toward total bankruptcy. I turned off the lights in my office and went to sleep, enjoying the most profound, interrupted rest I had experienced in 4 decades. The morning sun illuminated the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. I brewed a fresh pot of black coffee, sat at my command center, and opened my laptop. Brenda had an emergency meeting scheduled for 9 o'clock at the downtown law firm handling Uncle Garrison's estate. I knew this because she had proudly posted the location on her social media the night before, boasting to her followers about her impending multi-million-dollar wire transfer. Robert's legal associates operated in the exact same building, providing me with a flawless, detailed account of her glorious arrival. Brenda marched through the heavy glass doors of the probate office wearing the exact same designer coat she had purchased on credit. She bypassed the receptionist entirely and walked straight into the main conference room of Attorney Lawson. She did not sit down. She slapped her expensive new handbag onto the polished mahogany table and demanded the immediate transfer of Uncle Garrison's liquid assets directly into her private checking account. She arrogantly informed Lawson that she had luxury contractors waiting to remodel her suburban house, and a son who needed his massive allowance reinstated immediately. She spoke to the seasoned probate lawyer as if he were a slow, incompetent bank teller, deliberately holding up her lottery winnings. Lawson calmly instructed her to take a seat, noting her highly agitated and disrespectful state. Brenda flatly refused, crossing her arms and declaring she had no time for tedious legal technicalities. She wanted the offshore accounts liquidated and the millions wired by noon, citing her absolute uncontested status as the sole heir. She even slid a freshly printed copy of our expedited divorce waiver across the table, smugly pointing out that she had legally severed her husband from the incoming fortune. She firmly believed she was demonstrating supreme financial intelligence, locking down her empire from any potential parasites. She had absolutely no idea she was cheerfully handing the executioner a freshly sharpened blade. Lawson did not match her aggressive energy. He simply reached into his leather briefcase and extracted a heavy red ledger. He placed it squarely in the center of the table, pushing it toward Brenda. He informed her that there were no offshore accounts, no hidden safety deposit boxes, and absolutely zero liquid assets to transfer. Brenda scoffed, demanding to know what he meant, insisting Uncle Garrison owned massive manufacturing plants in Georgia and a highly profitable portfolio of commercial real estate. Lawson opened the ledger and presented the cold, hard reality of the estate. He meticulously explained that the manufacturing plants had been bankrupt for 5 years, running entirely on a severe deficit and failing to pay their basic operational costs. The commercial real estate properties she was so eager to claim were hopelessly leveraged against a series of predatory high-interest loans. Uncle Garrison had spent the last decade creating a chaotic maze of shell companies just to hide his catastrophic financial failures from his creditors. Brenda stared at the pages, her arrogant smirk slowly dissolving into a mask of pure confusion. She frantically tapped her manicured fingernail against the paper, arguing that the estate was appraised at $10 million. Lawson corrected her brutal misunderstanding. He clarified that the properties were originally appraised at that value a decade ago, but the massive accumulation of secondary mortgages had completely wiped out any remaining equity. Then Lawson delivered the final fatal blow. He turned to the last page of the dossier and revealed a formal stamped document from the federal government. He bluntly informed Brenda that Uncle Garrison's estate was currently carrying a $3 million federal tax lien for deliberate corporate tax evasion. The Internal Revenue Service had already placed a hard freeze on the failing business accounts and was preparing to seize every available asset to satisfy that massive debt. Brenda had not inherited a golden kingdom. She had inherited a financial graveyard. Every single piece of property, every factory, and every bank account associated with Garrison was flagged for federal seizure. The millions she had bragged about online simply did not exist. The staggering wealth she used to justify kicking me out of my own home was nothing but a toxic illusion. The overwhelming reality of the situation crashed down on Brenda with the force of a freight train. She stumbled backward, her knees giving out as she collapsed into the nearest leather office chair. She began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest as a severe panic attack seized her entire body. The designer coat she wore suddenly looked like a straitjacket. She gasped for air, her voice rising to a frantic, terrified shriek. She demanded that Lawson fix the problem immediately, screaming that she could not possibly owe the federal government $3 million. She ordered the attorney to reject the inheritance, to return the estate to the state, or to find a legal loophole to save her from the financial ruin staring her in the face. Lawson remained perfectly still, his voice devoid of any pity. He explained that by aggressively filing the initial probate claims yesterday afternoon and presenting herself as the sole undisputed executor of the estate, she had already assumed formal legal responsibility for the corporate entities. Brenda's eyes darted around the room in absolute terror. Desperation completely eclipsed her previous arrogance. She slammed her hands on the table and yelled at Lawson to drag me into the mess. She shrieked that I was her husband, a retired accountant with a substantial pension and pristine credit. She demanded the lawyer attach my name to the federal tax lien, insisting that my financial stability could absorb the debt and shield her from the incoming government seizure. Lawson slowly picked up the copy of the expedited divorce waiver Brenda had proudly handed him just 10 minutes prior. He held the document up, reading Clause 7 aloud with devastating clarity. He reminded her that she had permanently waived any and all of my rights claims or interests in her separate property, her current inheritances, and her subsequent debts. Lawson coldly explained that she had legally and permanently insulated me from Uncle Garrison's catastrophic liabilities. The trap I had carefully laid was now officially locked shut by her own hand. Brenda was the sole legal owner of the $3 million federal tax lien. There was no husband to drain, no safety net to catch her, and no way to escape the devastating consequences of her own unbridled greed. The crushing reality of a frozen platinum card and an impending mortgage default breeds a very specific type of desperation. Derek and Megan had spent the entire night scrambling for a financial lifeline after I severed their allowance. With Brenda completely paralyzed by her new $3 million federal tax, Lion, my son, and his calculating wife realized no bailout was coming. They needed immediate, untraceable cash. Their greedy minds naturally turned toward my old suburban investment property. It was a modest 4-bedroom house on the edge of the city that I had purchased 2 decades ago. I used it primarily as a private storage facility and a secondary office for my auditing firm. Derek knew I kept a heavy steel floor safe in the basement and housed several expensive antique collections in the main living room. He assumed the house was sitting unguarded while the divorce proceedings escalated. I sat in the quiet comfort of my downtown penthouse, sipping my morning espresso, while my secondary security monitors flashed to life. I had installed hidden motion-activated cameras throughout that property specifically for this inevitable moment. The high-definition feed showed Derek and Megan creeping through the overgrown backyard. Megan carried a heavy iron crowbar, her designer clothes stained with dirt from the muddy alleyway. Derek looked over his shoulder, sweating profusely, scanning the quiet neighborhood for any witnesses. He grabbed the crowbar from his wife and jammed it violently into the frame of the back patio door. The wood splintered with a loud crack echoing through the hidden microphones. They pushed their way inside, panting heavily, believing they had just successfully breached a treasure chest of my forgotten assets. They fully intended to pawn my antiques and empty my floor safe to cover their immediate debts. They possessed absolutely no respect for the law or my personal boundaries. I leaned back in my leather chair and watched them step into the hallway, waiting for the brutal realization to hit them. Derek sprinted down the hallway toward the main living room, instructing Megan to grab the velvet bags for the antique silver. He rounded the corner and stopped so abruptly that Megan slammed directly into his back. The high-definition camera captured the sheer, unadulterated shock draining the color from both of their faces. The house was completely empty. There was no antique silver, there were no imported Persian rugs, no vintage mahogany desks, and no expensive electronics. The heavy steel floor safe they so desperately planned to crack had been entirely uprooted from the concrete basement floor, leaving nothing but a shallow, dusty crater. I had not left a single stray paperclip behind. As a forensic auditor, I recognized the structural decay of my marriage and the mounting greed of my son, months before Brenda delivered her arrogant phone call. I knew they would attempt to plunder my secondary assets the moment my primary funds vanished. 3 weeks prior, I hired a proxy buyer through Vanguard Holdings, LLC, to legally liquidate every piece of interior property. I hired an overnight crew to pack the antiques, empty the safe, and strip the house to its bare foundations. I watched through the monitor as Derek frantically paced through the empty rooms, throwing open hollow closet doors and ripping off vent covers in a pathetic frenzy. He screamed my name into the empty space, kicking the drywall in a useless display of impotent rage. Megan dropped her empty velvet bags onto the bare floorboards. She pulled her hair in sheer panic as realizing their guaranteed payday was completely non-existent. They were standing inside a barren echo chamber, They had risked severe felony breaking and entering charges for a house that held absolutely nothing but dust and shadows. Derek punched a wooden doorframe, cursing his mother for failing them, and cursing me for always being 10 steps ahead. He pulled out his phone, attempting to call Brenda, completely unaware that his mother was currently drowning in a federal tax investigation. Their illusion of control was crumbling, rapidly replaced by the suffocating grip of their incoming financial ruin. I zoomed the camera feed in on Megan's face. She bit her fingernails, frantically calculating their next move. She suggested they strip the copper wiring from the walls to sell for scrap metal, proving exactly how far her wealthy facade had fallen. I recorded every second of their pathetic conspiracy, securing the digital footage to my encrypted server. Megan's desperate plan to strip the copper wiring was abruptly cut short by the blinding flash of blue and red lights illuminating the front windows. While liquidating the interior assets 3 weeks ago, I had also legally transferred the deed of the property to a private real estate development firm. I finalized the cash transaction under a strict non-disclosure agreement. The property no longer belonged to me in any capacity. It belonged to an aggressive corporate entity that did not tolerate trespassers. The developers had installed an independent silent perimeter alarm system that Derek triggered the moment he jammed the crowbar into the patio door. The silent alarm instantly notified the local police precinct and the property management company. 2 police cruisers aggressively pulled up to the curb, blocking the driveway completely. 4 heavily armed officers stepped out, shining high-powered flashlights directly through the front glass. A representative from the development firm arrived seconds later in a dark SUV, pointing furiously toward the splintered back door. Derek and Megan froze in the center of the empty living room like deer caught in headlights. The commanding voice of a police officer echoed through a bullhorn, ordering anyone inside the property to step out with their hands raised. Megan let out a terrified shriek, shoving Derek toward the back hallway. They abandoned their velvet bags and the iron crowbar on the floor, destroying any chance of denying their forced entry. They scrambled frantically toward the rear exit, slipping on the dusty floorboards in their expensive shoes. I watched them squeeze through the broken patio door, just as the officers breached the front entrance. Derek and Megan tore through the overgrown backyard, tearing their designer clothes on thorny bushes and scraping their hands as they blindly vaulted over the wooden privacy fence. They plummeted into the muddy alleyway on the other side, barely escaping the sweeping beams of the police flashlights. They managed to evade immediate physical arrest, but they left their fingerprints entirely over the crime scene. I saved the security footage and closed the viewing application. I took a slow, satisfying sip of my espresso. Derek and Megan were now broke, terrified, and officially fleeing from a felony crime scene, finally facing the devastating reality of their reckless greed. The panic of absolute financial ruin breeds a very predictable pattern of behavior. With the crushing reality of the $3 million federal tax lien wrapping around her neck, Brenda was running out of oxygen. She could not access Uncle Garrison's frozen empire, and Derek was completely useless to her now. She pivoted her desperation toward the only target she thought she still understood. She went after my visible retirement savings. I was sitting in my penthouse, reviewing the global market trends when my secure line rang. It was Mr. Sterling, the senior branch manager at the local bank, where I had maintained a modest personal checking and pension account for nearly 30 years. Sterling spoke in a hushed, urgent tone. He informed me that Brenda was currently sitting in his glass-enclosed office, creating a massive disruption. She was aggressively demanding the immediate freezing of all my personal assets. She presented a fabricated story to the bank staff, loudly claiming I had committed severe marital fraud and was attempting to illegally hide joint funds during a hostile separation. She demanded Sterling grant her full administrative access to my accounts so she could secure the money she claimed was rightfully hers. She was trying to drain the very pension she had mocked just 48 hours ago. She firmly believed the local bank tellers would simply bow to her aggressive demands to avoid a public scene. She severely underestimated the strict protocols of financial institutions and my long-standing relationship with the branch manager. Sterling had quietly placed her on a mandatory administrative hold, citing standard security verification procedures, and immediately called me directly. I thanked Sterling for his exceptional professionalism. I instructed him to offer Brenda a cup of coffee and keep her comfortably seated in his office for exactly 15 minutes. I ended the call and stood up from my desk. I put on a tailored charcoal suit, adjusted my silk tie, and dialed my attorney, Robert. I told him to meet me in the bank lobby. It was time to extinguish Brenda's final delusion of control. I walked through the heavy glass doors of the local bank precisely 15 minutes later. Robert arrived simultaneously, his sharp black briefcase gripping the absolute destruction of Brenda's legal standing. We walked smoothly across the polished tile floor, ignoring the curious glances of the tellers. Through the glass walls of the manager's office, I saw Brenda pacing like a trapped animal. Her designer coat looked entirely out of place in the quiet suburban financial institution. She was waving her hands, frantically attempting to intimidate Mr. Sterling, who sat perfectly still behind his desk. I pushed the glass door open. Brenda spun around, her eyes widening for a fraction of a second before twisting into a mask of pure, desperate rage. She pointed a shaking finger at my chest, shouting that I was a criminal trying to rob her blind. She demanded Sterling call the police and arrest me for financial abandonment. I did not acknowledge her frantic screaming. I did not even look at her. I directed my attention entirely to Mr. Sterling, offering him a polite nod for his patience. Robert stepped forward seamlessly, taking control of the room. He did not raise his voice. He simply opened his leather briefcase and extracted a thick document bearing the official embossed gold seal of the State Family Court. He placed it squarely on the manager's desk. Robert formally introduced himself as my chief legal counsel. He instructed Sterling to review the expedited finalized divorce decree. He specifically directed the manager's attention to Clause 7, the exact stipulation Brenda had aggressively signed in her greedy rush to secure her fake inheritance. Robert clearly stated that Brenda Hayes possessed absolutely no legal authority, no spousal rights, and zero claim to any account bearing my name. He declared her allegations of marital fraud completely baseless and bordering on criminal defamation. Sterling examined the court, Seal nodded professionally, and typed a quick command into his computer terminal. He looked up at Brenda with cold corporate detachment. He informed her that she was entirely removed from any association with my financial profiles. Her attempt to hijack my retirement funds was formally rejected and permanently locked out by the system. Brenda gasped, her chest heaving, as the inescapable reality of her isolation tightened around her throat. Brenda refused to accept her total defeat. She slammed her hands onto the manager's desk, screaming that the document was a fake and that she was entitled to half of my pension, regardless of what the paper said. She shrieked that she needed that money immediately to hire a defense team for the sudden federal tax audit I had somehow trapped her in. Her voice echoed loudly into the main lobby, drawing the shocked attention of every customer and bank employee present. She was publicly unraveling, shedding the refined upper-class image she had spent decades trying to project. Robert did not let her finish her frantic tirade. He reached into his briefcase a second time and pulled out another crisp, legally binding document. He stepped directly into her line of sight, forcing her to look at the paper. He formally served her with a court-ordered cease and desist mandate. Robert explained with brutal surgical precision that any further attempts to access my accounts, contact my financial institutions, or approach my physical person would result in immediate criminal charges for harassment and attempted extortion. He advised her to take whatever loose change she had left in her purse and hire a bankruptcy lawyer because my client was permanently out of her reach. Brenda stared at the document, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The towering arrogance that had defined her entire existence completely collapsed, leaving behind a terrified, bankrupt woman facing the devastating wrath of the federal government alone. Sterling calmly pressed a button under his desk. 2 uniformed bank security guards appeared at the glass door immediately. Sterling politely but firmly requested that Brenda vacate the premises, warning her that he would involve local law enforcement if she caused any further disruption to his branch. The guards stepped into the office, flanking her on both sides. Brenda looked at me one last time, searching my face for any sliver of the quiet, compliant husband she used to bully. She found nothing but a cold, impenetrable wall. The guards escorted her out of the office and marched her across the busy lobby. I stood comfortably in the quiet office, watching through the glass as the sliding doors closed behind her humiliated, retreating figure. My assets were completely secured and the infection was fully eradicated from my life. Megan stood in the center of her extravagant kitchen, holding a stack of unopened mail she had intercepted from the mailbox. Derek was upstairs, drowning his humiliation in cheap whiskey and a self-pitying stupor after the disastrous restaurant incident. He had locked himself in the guest bedroom, completely paralyzed by the sudden evaporation of his platinum lifestyle. Megan dropped the envelopes onto the marble island and tore into them with ruthless efficiency. She bypassed the standard utility bills and ripped open a thick envelope bearing the logo of their primary mortgage lender. Her eyes scanned the bold black text detailing a formal notice of acceleration. The document stated that due to consecutive missed payments and a sudden drop in credit reliability, the bank demanded the immediate repayment of the entire loan balance. Megan felt the cold grip of absolute panic tighten around her chest. She grabbed Derek's discarded laptop from the counter, bypassed his weak password, and dove directly into his personal banking dashboard. The digital numbers confirmed her worst nightmare. Derek possessed less than $4,000 in actual liquid cash. His investment portfolios were entirely fictional, built on margin accounts that were rapidly receiving margin calls. The illusion of his self-made success shattered right before her eyes. He was not a wealthy entrepreneur temporarily cut off by a bitter father. How was a financial parasite rapidly bleeding out? Megan slammed the laptop shut. She realized with horrifying clarity that she had legally anchored herself to a sinking ship. She had married Derek specifically for the safety net his father provided. Without my silent subsidies, Derek was a broke, incompetent liability, carrying hundreds of thousands of dollars in unsecured debt. Survival instinct completely overrode any lingering marital loyalty. She refused to go down with him. She refused to lose her designer wardrobe, her luxury vehicles, and her high society status because her husband was too foolish to secure his own inheritance. She needed a rapid exit strategy, and she needed it before Derek drained the last remaining drops of their joint capital to pay a useless bankruptcy attorney. Megan moved swiftly to her private home office, locking the solid oak door behind her. She booted up her own encrypted computer and accessed a secure virtual private network. Long before she married Derek, she had cultivated a ruthless pragmatism regarding financial self-preservation. She navigated to a clandestine banking portal based in the Cayman Islands. She had opened this dormant offshore account 3 years ago as a strict contingency plan, completely shielding it from Derek's knowledge. Today, that contingency plan became her primary lifeline. She pulled up the dashboard for their joint checking and savings accounts. Derek had managed to scrape together exactly $62,000, the absolute last remnants of an emergency fund I had gifted them for their wedding. It was the only unencumbered cash they had left to their name. Megan did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. She initiated a high-priority international wire transfer. She typed in the routing numbers for her offshore shell company, meticulously shifting the entire balance of $62,000 away from Derek's reach. She intended to leave him with an account balance of absolute zero. She justified the theft as a necessary severance package for enduring his profound incompetence. She reviewed the transfer details, ensuring her digital tracks were heavily obfuscated. She planned to pack her bags by dawn, book a one-way first-class flight, and vanish before Derek even woke up from his drunken sleep. She clicked the final authorization button, watching the progress bar load across the screen. The system prompted her for a secondary security verification, a standard procedure for large international sums. She typed in the joint account security PIN, holding her breath as the bank's servers processed the request. She envisioned a new life on a warm beach, completely unburdened by a ruined husband and a collapsing suburban facade. The screen flashed green, indicating the wire transfer was successfully initiated and pending immediate institutional review. Megan exhaled a sharp breath of relief, leaning back in her chair with a cold, triumphant smile. She believed she had executed the perfect escape, entirely confident that Derek was too inept to notice the missing funds until she was safely out of the country. She quickly deleted her browsing history, wiped the cache, and powered down the laptop. She stood up and walked toward her expansive walk-in closet, mentally cataloging which expensive handbags and diamond jewelry she could easily carry in her luggage. Her betrayal was silent, efficient, and utterly devoid of remorse. High above the city, inside the impenetrable silence of my penthouse command center, a glaring red notification suddenly dominated my center monitor. The piercing digital chime signaled a critical security breach within Vanguard Holdings LLC's extended financial network. When I established Derek and Megan's joint emergency fund 5 years ago, I embedded the account within my corporate banking infrastructure to monitor their reckless spending habits. I had deliberately left that specific account active during my initial purge, knowing the remaining balance would inevitably trigger a desperate reaction. I opened the alert and reviewed the encrypted data packet. The system had automatically halted an outbound international wire transfer of $62,000. I analyzed the destination routing numbers and immediately recognized the digital signature of a Cayman Islands offshore account. A quick trace of the originating IP address confirmed the transaction was initiated from Megan's private home office. I watched her entire cowardly exit strategy unfold in raw financial data. She was attempting to strip her husband of his last remaining lifeline and abandon him to face the creditors entirely alone. Her sheer ruthlessness perfectly mirrored Brenda's greed. I did not block the transfer to save Derek's money. I blocked the transfer to ensure their mutual destruction was completely inescapable. I executed a manual override permanently freezing the joint account under a fraud investigation protocol. The $62,000 was now locked in a digital purgatory utterly inaccessible to both of them. I then compiled the raw data into a pristine, undeniable digital dossier. I captured the timestamps, the destination account details, and the IP address directly linking the theft to Megan's computer. I opened my encrypted email client and drafted a new message addressed directly to Derek. I did not include a greeting or a single word of paternal sympathy. I simply attached the comprehensive fraud report and typed a single sentence in the subject line detailing his wife's attempted robbery. I hit send, ensuring the email bypassed his spam filters and landed directly in his primary inbox. I leaned back in my leather chair, watching the delivery confirmation flash across the screen. Derek would wake up to discover that his financial ruin was not just an external attack, but an intimate betrayal, orchestrated by the woman sleeping down the hall. I closed the terminal and walked toward my expansive windows, looking down at the quiet city streets. The internal rot of their marriage was now fully exposed, ready to consume them from the inside out. The harsh morning sunlight offered absolutely no comfort to Brenda. She sat at the expensive mahogany dining table of the suburban house, aggressively tapping her manicured nails against the wood. She had spent the entire previous day spiraling from the brutal revelation at the probate attorney's office. Yet her towering arrogance refused to accept total defeat. She had convinced herself that the $3 million tax lien was simply a bureaucratic error, a temporary administrative hurdle her newly hired defense lawyers would easily squash. She firmly believed the government would eventually unlock Uncle Garrison's massive estate and restore her rightful millionaire status. A sharp, authoritative series of heavy knocks at the front door interrupted her frantic internal justifications. Brenda stood up, tightening her designer silk robe, fully expecting the arrival of the private contractors she had foolishly booked on credit earlier that week. She yanked the front door open, fully preparing to scold them for their tardiness. Instead, she found two individuals dressed in immaculate, unbranded dark suits standing squarely on her front porch. They did not carry toolboxes or fabric swatches. The lead agent, a tall man with a completely impassive expression, held a thick official leather binder. He displayed a gold badge identifying himself as a senior investigator for the Internal Revenue Service. Brenda froze, her hand gripping the brass door handle so tightly her knuckles turned white. The agent did not wait for an invitation. He stepped forward and handed her a thick stack of formally stamped legal documents. He stated with brutal clarity that he was executing a direct collection mandate. He informed her that as the sole legal executor and primary beneficiary of Garrison's corporate entities, she was now personally and entirely responsible for a massive, deliberate tax evasion scheme spanning over a decade. He read the exact figure aloud, letting the devastating sum of $3 million echo across the quiet suburban lawn. Brenda stared at the terrifying federal seal printed on the top page, feeling the last remaining threads of her golden illusion snap completely. Pure survival instinct instantly overrode Brenda's shock, manifesting as the exact same vicious entitlement she had weaponized against me for 40 years. She dropped the heavy stack of federal documents onto the entryway console table and immediately shifted to the offensive. She aggressively pointed her finger at the federal agents, her voice rising to a shrill, frantic pitch. She loudly declared that they were harassing the wrong person, claiming she was just a grieving niece who was completely innocent of complex corporate structuring. She furiously spun a fabricated narrative insisting that the true financial mastermind of the family was her husband. She demanded the agents write down my name, proudly spelling out Rufus Hayes, and confidently recited the address of my former accounting firm. She threw me directly into the path of the federal investigation without a single microsecond of hesitation. She detailed my long career as a forensic auditor, weaponizing my professional expertise to convince the agents that I was the one secretly managing Uncle Garrison's fraudulent ledgers behind the scenes. Brenda demanded they redirect their entire collection mandate toward my personal retirement accounts and my private banking profiles. She insisted they investigate my private holding companies, throwing out any financial term she had ever overheard me use to make her lies sound credible. She assured them that my pristine credit and substantial pension were more than enough to satisfy the government's immediate demands. She practically ordered the agents to drive downtown and arrest me for marital financial fraud, insisting that I had deliberately trapped her in this situation to avoid paying my own share of the massive debt. She crossed her arms, lifting her chin with a desperate, triumphant smirk, thoroughly convinced she had just executed a brilliant legal maneuver. She believed she had successfully transferred the crushing weight of the $3 million guillotine straight onto my shoulders. She expected the agents to nod in agreement, take my information, and leave her property in peace. She severely miscalculated the depth of the trap I had built and the relentless efficiency of the federal government. The lead agent did not write down my name. He did not pull out a notepad or show a single flicker of interest in Brenda's frantic accusations. Instead, he reached back into his leather binder and extracted a single perfectly preserved sheet of paper bearing the golden embossed seal of the state family court. He held the document up directly in front of her face. Brenda's triumphant smirk instantly vanished as she recognized her own aggressive, desperate signature slashed across the bottom line. The agent looked her dead in the eye and coldly informed her that the Internal Revenue Service conducts comprehensive background checks on all high-value asset seizures. He explained that their department had already reviewed the expedited finalized divorce decree filed by my attorney Robert. He began reading Clause 7 aloud, reciting the exact legal phrasing Brenda had blindly ignored. He emphasized the specific stipulation where she permanently and completely waived all rights to encumber her husband with her separate property, her current inheritances, and her subsequent debts. The agent stated with absolute surgical precision that Rufus Hayes was legally and irrevocably absolved of any connection to Uncle Garrison's toxic empire. My financial firewall was officially recognized and heavily respected by the federal government. Brenda gasped for air, her chest heaving as the inescapable trap clamped shut around her neck. The agent smoothly placed the copy of the divorce waiver on top of the collection notice. He then delivered the final devastating blow. He informed her that because she was the sole liable entity, the federal government would not waste time negotiating. He stated they had already initiated the formal process to freeze her personal checking accounts, cancel her active credit lines, and garnish any potential incoming revenue she might try to hide. He coldly advised her to pack whatever personal belongings she could fit into a single suitcase. He promised that the collection enforcement team would arrive by Friday morning to officially seize the suburban house, her vehicles, and every luxury item she had recently purchased on credit to satisfy the federal debt. The agents turned and walked back to their dark vehicle, leaving Brenda completely isolated on her front porch, staring directly into the terrifying abyss of her own absolute ruin. It was only a matter of time before a trapped animal lashed out blindly to survive. 2 days after the federal tax agents left Brenda utterly paralyzed on her front porch, a process server managed to bypass the concierge desk of my downtown high-rise. He left a thick manila envelope bearing the letterhead of a notoriously aggressive low-tier law firm known for taking desperate cases on contingency. I brought the envelope up to my penthouse and sliced it open with a silver letter opener. It was a formal subpoena hastily drafted and dripping with legal desperation. Brenda had somehow convinced this bottom-feeding attorney to launch a massive fishing expedition against my private life. The document demanded a comprehensive, mandatory audit of my entire financial history, aggressively claiming I had committed severe marital fraud. Her new lawyer spun a wildly fabricated narrative, alleging that I had utilized my extensive background as a forensic auditor to deliberately conceal a massive private fortune during our marriage. The filing explicitly accused me of orchestrating a campaign of psychological manipulation. They argued that I had coerced a grieving, vulnerable woman into signing the expedited divorce waiver, specifically to protect my hidden millions from being rightfully divided in family court. Brenda was attempting to invalidate Clause 7 by painting herself as an innocent, naive victim who was maliciously tricked into absorbing Uncle Garrison's toxic empire. She firmly believed that forcing a judge to look at my Vanguard Holdings accounts would magically shift her $3 million federal tax burden back onto my shoulders. She was banking on the assumption that the sheer intimidation of a sweeping financial audit would force me to settle quietly and bail her out to protect my privacy. I read the poorly constructed legal threats and felt absolutely no anxiety whatsoever. Brenda fundamentally misunderstood how the law worked when dealing with irrefutable paper trails. She was bringing a plastic knife to a gunfight. I immediately scanned the heavy subpoena and transmitted the digital copy directly to Robert via our encrypted legal portal. He arrived at my penthouse less than an hour later, his polished black briefcase matching his utterly unbothered demeanor. We sat at my expansive mahogany dining table, spreading out the meticulous timeline of Brenda's colossal stupidity. Robert did not view the subpoena as a legitimate legal threat. He viewed it as a phenomenal opportunity to legally obliterate her credibility on the public record, ensuring she could never attempt another frivolous lawsuit against my estate. We methodically compiled the counter-documentation, building an impenetrable fortress of verified evidence. I pulled the digital audio file of the initial phone call Brenda had made to my office, the very call where she proudly bragged about her multi-million-dollar inheritance and ruthlessly ordered me to vacate the house. We paired that audio recording with the security footage from the suburban property's front porch camera. The high-definition video clearly captured her aggressive arrival, her brandishing of her new designer coat, and her eager, uncoerced signature on the divorce papers. The footage explicitly showed Megan and Derek aggressively encouraging her to sign the waiver to protect her supposed millions from me. There was absolutely zero evidence of coercion, manipulation, or psychological distress. It was pure, unadulterated greed recorded in perfect, undeniable clarity. Robert also gathered the extensive, pristine records of my private holding companies. We did not hide my wealth. We presented it exactly as it was structured. I had built Vanguard Holdings using strictly independent, non-marital capital, meticulously keeping every single penny segregated from our joint household accounts for decades. We organized the financial ledgers to demonstrate absolute transparency, proving my forensic accounting was completely legal and fully compliant with state tax laws. Brenda's lawyer was hoping I would scramble to hide my assets. Instead, we formatted a flawless 500-page audit ready for immediate judicial review. We bound the files in heavy black folders, sealing the indisputable truth that Brenda had initiated the eviction, demanded the separation, and eagerly claimed her toxic inheritance entirely on her own. We were ready for court. The emergency hearing took place the following morning in a sterile, brightly lit downtown courtroom. Brenda sat at the plaintiff's table wearing a conservative gray dress in a pathetic, highly calculated attempt to look impoverished and victimized. Her aggressive lawyer stood up, puffing out his chest, and began to deliver a fiery, theatrical speech about hidden wealth and cruel spousal deception. He painted me as a manipulative mastermind who had robbed a helpless woman of her rightful marital support. He passionately demanded the judge grant an immediate injunction against my corporate assets. I sat perfectly still beside Robert, watching the amateur performance conclude. The presiding judge, an older, no-nonsense magistrate with zero tolerance for frivolous litigation, turned his stern gaze toward our defense table. Robert did not deliver a dramatic speech. He simply stood up and handed the judge the heavy black folders containing our comprehensive financial audit, alongside a secure digital tablet containing the audio and video evidence. The judge spent 10 agonizing minutes reviewing the files in absolute silence. The courtroom felt completely devoid of oxygen. Brenda's lawyer shifted nervously on his feet as the judge plugged in a headset and watched the video of Brenda eagerly signing the waiver on his private monitor. When the judge finally looked up, his expression was colder than ice. He stated with brutal finality that he had never seen a more transparent attempt to weaponize the judicial system to escape the consequences of personal greed. He declared my financial audit utterly flawless and entirely legal. The judge then directed his absolute fury toward Brenda's attorney. He aggressively reprimanded the lawyer for filing a subpoena based on easily disprovable lies without conducting a basic preliminary investigation into his client's claims. He slammed his heavy wooden gavel down, immediately dismissing the subpoena with extreme prejudice. He did not stop there. The judge imposed severe financial sanctions directly on Brenda's legal counsel for wasting the court's time with a fraudulent, malicious claim. The attorney turned pale, instantly realizing his promised contingency payday had just mutated into a massive personal fine. Brenda let out a choked gasp, realizing her final desperate attempt to steal my money had completely evaporated into thin air. The judge ordered them to vacate his courtroom immediately. Robert and I calmly packed our briefcases and walked out through the heavy wooden doors, leaving Brenda trapped at the table with a furious, sanctioned lawyer who was already demanding she pay his penalties in cash. The swift legal destruction of Brenda in the downtown courtroom was merely the opening act of my master plan, while she was busy absorbing the shock of a massive judicial sanction. I shifted my focus to the suburban enclave where my son and his calculating wife were currently hiding. I sat in my penthouse command center and opened the specific financial portfolio dedicated to Derek. Weeks ago, knowing his platinum credit card was his only lifeline, I had instructed Vanguard Holdings to purchase the secondary debt on his upscale property. Derek and Megan had financed their lavish lifestyle through a fragile web of adjustable-rate mortgages and predatory home equity lines of credit. Once I severed his supplementary income, his entire financial ecosystem collapsed within a matter of days. He missed his primary mortgage payment, triggering an automatic default clause hidden deep within his loan agreement. I did not send a polite reminder or offer a grace period. I directed my corporate attorneys to execute a brutal and immediate notice of acceleration. A certified process server arrived at Derek's pristine front door exactly at noon. Through the integrated security alerts I monitored on my screens, I watched the digital confirmation of delivery register in real time. Derek accepted the thick certified envelope entirely unaware that he was holding his own eviction notice. The legal document explicitly stated that his account was critically delinquent. Because his credit score had plummeted following the immediate rejection of his luxury expenses, the bank invoked their right to demand the immediate repayment of the entire accelerated mortgage balance. I was ordered to produce $640,000 within 48 hours or face total property foreclosure. I pictured Megan standing over his shoulder in their expensive kitchen, watching the illusion of their upper-class suburban life evaporate into thin air. They were suddenly backed into the exact same corner they had proudly tried to force me into just weeks prior. They had no savings, no incoming inheritance, and absolutely no legal ground to stand on. Desperation forces arrogant people to perform tasks they usually consider beneath them. Derek had never bothered to read a financial document in his entire life, always relying on my invisible safety net to catch his reckless mistakes. Now, staring at a $640,000 demand letter, he was forced to actually analyze his catastrophic situation. My secure servers tracked his frantic digital footprint as he desperately logged into his original mortgage lending portal. He attempted to access his payment history to negotiate a temporary settlement or secure a desperate forbearance plan. The system immediately locked him out, displaying a cold automated message stating that his original debt had been legally sold and transferred to a secondary corporate entity. I watched the keystroke logs as Derek frantically searched the state business registry, trying to locate a phone number or a physical address for this mysterious new debt collector, whom firmly believed he could charm or negotiate his way out of the foreclosure by promising future payments from Uncle Garrison's toxic estate, completely oblivious to the fact that the estate was currently being dismantled by federal tax agents. He pulled up the official transfer deed attached to the acceleration notice. His eyes scanned the heavy legal text until he reached the assigned beneficiary line. He typed the name of the purchasing entity into the search bar. The screen returned the official corporate registration for Vanguard Holdings, LLC. I sat back in my leather chair and took a slow sip of my black coffee, savoring the absolute precision of the trap. Derek was staring directly at the exact same corporate name he had mocked on the front porch the day he tried to steal my luxury sedan. He had laughed in my face when I told him I controlled a private holding company, calling me a pathetic old man trying to invent a fake business. Now that exact fake business held the exclusive legal right to seize his home, liquidate his assets, and throw him onto the street. He scrambled to find the registered agent for Vanguard Holdings, desperately hoping it was a massive faceless conglomerate he could stall with legal red tape. Instead, the registry listed a single heavily encrypted downtown address, which was my exact address. The horrifying realization hit Derek with the devastating force of a physical blow. The secure communication portal on my desk chimed as an urgent email arrived in my private inbox. Derek had bypassed the corporate contact forms and messaged me directly. The subject line contained no arrogant demands or entitled insults. It was a frantic, terrified plea for mercy. He had finally connected the pieces of the puzzle. He remembered Megan reading the vehicle registration card aloud on the driveway. He remembered my cold assurance that Vanguard Holdings was a secure entity over which I possessed absolute and sole legal control. He suddenly understood that the faceless corporate machine threatening to rip his home away was actually his own father. I opened the email and read his pathetic words. He begged me to stop the foreclosure process, swearing that he had no idea his original lender had sold the mortgage. He pleaded that Megan was suffering from severe panic attacks and that they had absolutely nowhere else to go. He completely abandoned his arrogant persona, crying through the text about how he was my only son and asking how I could possibly put him out on the street. The profound irony of his situation was a masterpiece of absolute justice. I read his desperate message and felt a deep, unwavering sense of peace. Just weeks ago, he had stood in the hallway of my home alongside Brenda, mocking my age and eagerly demanding I pack my bags so they could remodel my property. He had proudly cheered when his mother ordered me to vacate the premises by 5 o'clock. He had shown zero hesitation, zero compassion, and zero respect when he believed he held the power. Now the tables were permanently turned. I possessed the absolute legal authority to evict my own son, perfectly mirroring the exact cruelty he had happily endorsed. I did not type a long emotional response to his email. I did not offer a single word of comfort or explanation. I simply forwarded his message to my attorney, Robert, with a single attached instruction. I ordered Robert to proceed with the maximum legal foreclosure penalty and to reject any and all settlement offers Derek might attempt to submit. I closed the email application, leaving Derek to wait in agonizing silence for a rescue that would never come. I sat at a quiet corner table in a high-end downtown cafe, reviewing the latest quarterly reports for my investment portfolios. The rich aroma of freshly roasted espresso filled the air, providing a stark contrast to the absolute desperation about to crash through the front door. The heavy glass door swung open with a violent shove. Derek stumbled into the cafe, scanning the busy room frantically. His designer clothes were severely wrinkled, his tie was missing, and his eyes were heavily bloodshot from sleep deprivation. He had clearly spent the last 48 hours tracking my daily routine, desperately hunting for a face-to-face confrontation after my legal team ignored his frantic emails. He spotted me in the corner and practically sprinted across the polished wooden floor. He did not puff out his chest or attempt to use his usual arrogant posturing. He crashed into the empty chair across from me, knocking the ceramic sugar dispenser off the table. The sharp clatter drew the immediate attention of the barista and several other wealthy patrons. Derek completely ignored the staring crowd. He dropped his expensive leather briefcase, grabbed the edge of my table, and literally slid out of his chair until his knees hit the hardwood floor. My 34-year-old son was kneeling in public, crying uncontrollably. He begged me to call off the corporate lawyers and stop the accelerated foreclosure on his home. He pleaded that Megan had completely emptied their remaining joint accounts and vanished, leaving him entirely alone to face the massive bank debt. He sobbed that he had absolutely no cash left to hire a defense attorney and no friends willing to loan him the money to save his property. He grabbed the sleeve of my tailored suit, tears streaming down his panicked face, pleading with me to remember that he was my only child. He begged me to show some parental mercy and sign the legal release papers before the bank officially locked him out of his house by the end of the week. I did not pull my arm away. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not offer a single word of comfort. I simply took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee, letting the scorching heat of the liquid match the absolute coldness in my chest. I looked down at the weeping man gripping my suit jacket. I instructed him to release my sleeve immediately and stand up, keeping my voice dangerously low and completely devoid of paternal affection. Derek scrambled back into the chair, wiping his face with the back of his trembling hand, desperately waiting for a lifeline. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. I forced him to look directly into my eyes. I methodically transported his memory back to the exact evening he stood on the front porch of my former suburban house. I reminded him of the mocking smirk plastered across his face when he proudly backed Brenda's ruthless eviction demand. I quoted his exact words back to him with surgical precision. I reminded him that he called me a pathetic old man and explicitly ordered me to get off the property without begging for a cut of his mother's new millions. I pointed out the sheer staggering hypocrisy of his current position. He had eagerly watched his mother try to cast me out into the street with absolutely nothing but a single leather duffel bag. He had gleefully anticipated my financial ruin, fully expecting to feast on the scraps of Uncle Garrison's toxic estate. He showed absolutely zero mercy, zero respect, and zero hesitation when he firmly believed he held the winning hand. I stated that he only discovered the concept of family loyalty the precise second his bank accounts hit zero and his wife abandoned him to the wolves. I told him that respect is not a retroactive currency he can suddenly spend to buy his way out of a legal foreclosure. He had explicitly chosen to sever our relationship the moment he demanded I leave without a dime. I clarified that I was simply honoring the exact dynamic he had eagerly established on that porch. I was treating him exactly like a defaulting delinquent tenant, occupying a commercial property owned by Vanguard Holdings, LLC. Derek stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, as he desperately searched for a counter-argument that simply did not exist. The crushing reality of his absolute isolation finally suffocated his remaining hope. He weakly attempted to shift the blame, sobbing that Brenda and Megan had manipulated him into being cruel. He claimed he was just trying to support his mother and keep his wife happy, begging me to understand the intense pressure he was under to maintain his lifestyle. I cut his pathetic excuses off immediately. I stated that a grown man takes full ownership of his personal choices. I told him that actions carry permanent, devastating consequences and no amount of public weeping can reverse a legally executed financial foreclosure. I informed him that my corporate attorneys had strict orders to reject any settlement offers, any forbearance requests, and any further communication from him whatsoever. I advised him to stop wasting his remaining hours crying in a coffee shop and start packing his belongings into whatever cardboard boxes he could find before the local sheriff arrived to physically remove him. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a crisp $20 bill. I placed it neatly on the table to cover the cost of my espresso and the sugar dispenser Derek had violently knocked over. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored suit jacket, completely ignoring the frantic, terrified pleas spilling from his mouth. Derek slid out of the chair again, collapsing onto the floor, clutching his head as he sobbed loudly into the polished wood. The entire cafe watched in stunned silence as the illusion of his arrogant, upper-class life completely disintegrated in public. The wealthy patrons who had once been his peers now looked at him with profound disgust and pity. I did not look back. I turned around and walked steadily toward the heavy glass exit. I stepped out onto this busy downtown sidewalk, embracing the vibrant noise of the city. The toxic infection of my son's entitlement was permanently eradicated from my life. I walked toward my corporate headquarters, leaving Derek trapped on the floor of the cafe, completely abandoned, to face the brutal, uncompromising reality of his incoming eviction. The digital lockdown of the Cayman Islands wire transfer left Megan completely cornered. With the $62,000 frozen and the bank officially seizing her upscale property by the end of the week, her carefully crafted exit strategy had evaporated. She possessed absolutely no loyalty to Derek, who was currently weeping in a downtown cafe, utterly useless to her survival. Megan required immediate, untraceable liquid assets to fund a domestic escape. Her predatory instincts naturally pivoted to the only vulnerable target remaining in her proximity. She drove her luxury SUV, which was weeks away from repossession, to the suburban house Brenda had violently claimed during the divorce. Brenda was completely consumed by the crushing $3 million federal tax lien and spent her days desperately harassing discount bankruptcy attorneys. Megan knew the house would be empty. She parked a block away to avoid detection. She walked through to the manicured neighbor's yard and approached the rear patio. She still possessed the spare emergency key Brenda had given Derek years ago, a crucial security flaw Brenda was too arrogant to rectify. Megan unlocked the back door and slipped inside the quiet house. She moved swiftly up the carpeted stairs directly toward the master suite. Her target was the heavy mahogany jewelry box sitting on the vanity. Brenda had recently purchased several extravagant diamond pieces on credit during her brief delusional celebration of Uncle Garrison's estate. Megan also knew Brenda kept the vintage emerald necklace and heavy gold bracelets acquired during our marriage inside that exact box. Megan opened the velvet-lined drawers and began aggressively shoving the expensive jewelry into the bottom of her designer leather tote bag. She did not care about the sentimental value of the items. She only calculated their raw pawn value in a different state. She stripped the vanity completely bare, securing enough stolen wealth to easily finance a new identity far away from the collapsing ruins of the Hayes family. She zipped the tote bag closed and turned toward the bedroom door, fully intending to vanish. Megan's calculated escape shattered the moment she stepped out of the master bedroom and into the upstairs hallway. The front door swung open downstairs, followed by the heavy, angry footsteps of a woman pushed to the absolute brink of sanity. Brenda had returned home early after another brutal rejection from a local law firm refusing to take her federal tax case without a massive cash retainer. She stomped up the wooden stairs, muttering furiously to herself, only to freeze at the top landing. Brenda stared at her daughter-in-law, her eyes immediately locking on to the bulging leather tote bag clutched tightly against Megan's chest. The shiny clasp of a diamond tennis bracelet was visibly caught in the zipper. The realization of the theft hit Brenda like a physical blow. The absolute entitlement that defined Brenda's entire existence flared into blind, violent rage. She screamed at Megan, demanding she drop the stolen jewelry immediately. Megan did not cower or apologize. The impending threat of poverty stripped away her polite high society facade. She tightened her grip on the bag and aggressively shoved her way past Brenda, attempting to reach the staircase. Brenda lunged forward, grabbing the heavy strap of the tote bag. A vicious screaming altercation erupted in the narrow hallway. Two women entirely consumed by greed and facing absolute financial ruin turned violently on each other. Brenda shrieked insults, calling Megan a manipulative parasite who had drained Derek dry and was now trying to rob her blind. Megan violently yanked the bag, screaming back that Brenda was a pathetic, bankrupt fool who had stupidly thrown away a millionaire husband to inherit a mountain of federal debt. The physical struggle escalated rapidly. They clawed at each other, tearing expensive fabric and knocking framed family portraits off the walls. The glass shattered against the hardwood floor as they wrestled their way down the staircase. Brenda slapped Megan across the face, fueled by the terrifying reality that those stolen jewels were her only remaining assets to pay off the looming government seizure. Megan kicked back viciously, fighting for her only ticket out of the collapsing suburban nightmare. Their shrieks of hatred echoed through the open front door, broadcasting their total moral decay to the entire neighborhood. The violent commotion did not go unnoticed. The affluent suburban neighborhood prized absolute silence and pristine appearances. The aggressive screaming and the sound of shattering glass deeply disturbed the surrounding residents. The elderly couple living directly across the street immediately dialed the emergency dispatch line, reporting a severe domestic disturbance. Within minutes, 2 police cruisers arrived at the property with their sirens wailing. The officers sprinted up the driveway and discovered Brenda and Megan physically brawling on the front lawn. The leather tote bag had ripped completely open during the struggle. Diamond necklaces, heavy gold bracelets, and expensive watches were scattered across the manicured grass, glittering under the harsh afternoon sun. The police officers aggressively separated the 2 women, forcing them onto the ground and restraining them. Brenda was hyperventilating, her clothes torn and her hair completely disheveled. She pointed a shaking finger at Megan, screaming at the top of her lungs that her daughter-in-law had broken into her house to commit grand larceny. She frantically demanded the officers arrest Megan immediately to protect her stolen assets. Megan sobbed uncontrollably, attempting to claim the jewelry belonged to her, but her torn pockets and the spare key clutched in her hand proved the forced entry and theft. The officers read Megan her Miranda rights, snapping cold metal handcuffs around her wrists. They escorted the weeping, humiliated daughter-in-law to the back of a police cruiser. Several neighbors stood on their porches, silently watching the spectacular public disintegration of a family that had spent years projecting an image of absolute superiority. Brenda dropped to her knees on the grass, frantically gathering her scattered jewelry with shaking, desperate hands, ignoring the judgmental stares of her peers. I sat in my downtown penthouse reading the automated police scanner alerts tied to Brenda's residential address. I pulled up the formal arrest record online the moment it was processed into the county database. Megan was officially booked into the county jail on severe felony charges of grand larceny and breaking and entering. Derek was currently a homeless, weeping mess. Brenda was a public spectacle, desperately clutching stolen jewelry to delay a federal tax seizure. The internal rot of their alliance was completely exposed, and they were systematically destroying each other exactly as I had anticipated. The sterile environment of the downtown legal conference room offered a stark contrast to the absolute chaos consuming Brenda's life. We gathered around a massive oak table for a final, highly anticipated deposition. This mandatory legal proceeding was required by the federal bankruptcy court to formally dissolve any lingering marital ties between my clean corporate assets and Uncle Garrison's toxic estate. I sat beside Robert, wearing a tailored navy suit, maintaining my usual perfect silence. Brenda arrived 15 minutes late. She looked utterly exhausted, her expensive designer clothes replaced by a wrinkled off-the-rack blouse. The heavy, crushing stress of the $3 million tax lien and Megan's recent grand larceny arrest had aged her 10 years in a matter of weeks. Yet, as she sat across from me and raised her right hand to swear an oath to tell the absolute truth, a desperate, venomous spark ignited in her eyes. She was a cornered animal, preparing to launch her final, pathetic strike. Her newly appointed bankruptcy attorney guided her through her initial testimony. Brenda stared directly at the court reporter and unleashed a meticulously fabricated narrative. She testified under penalty of perjury that I had orchestrated a campaign of extreme psychological terror. She claimed I had physically intimidated her on the afternoon of Uncle Garrison's death. She wept fake tears, wiping her dry eyes with a tissue, stating that I had aggressively forced her to sign the divorce waiver entirely against her will. She told the room that I had cruelly packed my bags and abandoned her, manipulating the complex legal documents to hoard my hidden wealth while trapping her with her uncle's federal debts. She insisted she was a naive, grieving woman who never wanted a divorce and never asked me to leave the suburban house. She firmly believed this dramatic performance would invalidate Clause 7 and somehow force a judge to make me shoulder her massive federal liabilities. I listened to her string of desperate lies without moving a single muscle in my face. I knew she was blindly digging a legal hole she could never possibly climb out of. Brenda's attorney concluded his direct examination with a dramatic sigh, resting his case on the false premise of a terrified, manipulated wife. He sat down firmly, believing he had successfully established the groundwork to void our financial separation. Robert adjusted his suit jacket, stood up slowly, and approached the center of the room. He did not raise his voice or show any aggression. He asked Brenda a single clarifying question. He asked her to explicitly confirm, under the strict penalty of perjury, that she never demanded I leave the property and that her signature on the waiver was obtained through my direct physical coercion. Brenda lifted her chin, defiantly glared at me, and stated for the official record that she was absolutely certain of her testimony. She swore I had bullied her into submission. Robert offered a cold, satisfied nod. He returned to our side of the table, opened his sleek silver laptop, and connected a small, high-powered portable speaker. He informed the court reporter that he was submitting Defense Exhibit A into the permanent legal record. He pressed a single button on his keyboard. The quiet conference room was instantly filled with the sharp, arrogant sound of Brenda's own voice. It was the exact audio recording of the phone call she had made to my office on the afternoon of Uncle Garrison's death. Every single word she had spoken that day echoed off the soundproof walls with brutal, undeniable clarity. The recording captured her demanding, "I pack my things immediately." It played her breathless, intoxicating bragging about inheriting millions of dollars, manufacturing plants, and commercial real estate. It broadcasted her aggressive, unprompted command ordering me out of her house before 5 o'clock. The audio explicitly proved she had proudly declared the inheritance was separate property and that I would get absolutely nothing. She had commanded me not to fight her for a single dime. The recording ended with a sharp click followed by a heavy, suffocating silence in the room. Brenda's face drained of all color, transforming into a sickly pale mask of absolute horror. She stared at the laptop as if it were a loaded weapon pointed directly at her chest. Her attorney physically shrank in his chair, rubbing his forehead in sheer disbelief as he realized his client had just lied under oath on the official federal record. The court reporter's fingers hovered motionless above the stenography machine. Robert closed his laptop with a sharp, definitive snap that made Brenda physically jump in her seat. He looked directly at her attorney and stated that submitting knowingly false testimony in a federal deposition constitutes severe, actionable perjury. He reminded the room that Brenda had just sworn under oath that she was a terrified, coerced victim only for her own recorded voice to expose her as a greedy, aggressive architect of her own isolation. Her entire legal credibility was instantly and permanently obliterated. Any remote chance she possessed of convincing a judge that she was an innocent bystander to Uncle Garrison's corporate tax evasion vanished into thin air. By lying so blatantly about the divorce waiver, she proved to the federal bankruptcy representatives that she was highly capable of deliberate financial deception. The IRS agents would undoubtedly use this exact transcript to justify seizing her remaining assets without any hesitation or leniency. Robert submitted the authenticated digital file to the court reporter and officially concluded his cross-examination. He stated we had no further use for a witness who flagrantly abused the judicial process. Brenda opened her mouth to speak desperately, trying to formulate an excuse, but no sound materialized. Her attorney quickly raised his hand to silence her, his face flushed with professional embarrassment and rising panic. He aggressively whispered to Brenda that she was now facing potential criminal charges for perjury on top of the $3 million Internal Revenue Service collection mandate. She had effectively destroyed her last shred of defense against the federal government. She could no longer play the naive, manipulated housewife. The government would now view her as a hostile, calculating debtor who actively lied to protect her non-existent assets. I stood up from my leather chair and buttoned my suit jacket. I looked down at the woman who had spent 4 decades treating me like a disposable burden. She was completely cornered, crushed by the inescapable weight of her own arrogance and deceit. Robert packed his briefcase, and we walked silently toward the heavy glass doors of the conference room. I stepped out into the bright, bustling hallway, leaving Brenda trapped at the table with a furious attorney forced to face the catastrophic criminal reality of the exact situation she had so eagerly created. I sat in the quiet command center of my penthouse, looking at the advanced digital copy of a prominent global financial magazine. For decades, I had meticulously guarded my privacy, operating entirely from the shadows to protect my assets from my greedy family. Today, I authorize my corporate public relations firm to permanently lift the strict non-disclosure embargo surrounding Vanguard Holdings, LLC. The cover story featured my holding company, and by direct extension, my true identity. The article detailed my deliberate transition from a seemingly modest forensic auditor to the sole controller of a multi-billion-dollar private equity empire. It highlighted my recent aggressive acquisitions, including the secondary debt markets where I had effortlessly purchased my own son's mortgage. The leak was meticulously timed and executed with surgical precision. I wanted the entire financial world, and specifically my soon-to-be ex-wife, to fully comprehend the staggering magnitude of her miscalculation. The publication hit the international newsstands and premium digital platforms precisely at 6 in the morning. My phone remained perfectly silent because I had already filtered all incoming communications from anyone outside my immediate corporate executive circle. The article explicitly painted me as a ruthless, brilliant strategist who hid his massive wealth in plain sight while living a quiet, unassuming suburban life. It praised my flawless execution of corporate takeovers and my ironclad legal insulation against toxic liabilities. I poured my morning black coffee, watching the digital analytics flash across my monitors as the article went viral across the local high society networks. Brenda and Derek had spent years treating me like a disposable, fixed-income failure. Now the entire elite financial sector was analyzing and praising my empire. The contrast was absolute and devastating. I had securely cemented my legacy, and I chose this exact moment to let the blinding light of my true net worth shine directly into the darkest corners of their impending poverty. My private investigator forwarded me a series of high-definition photographs tracking Brenda's movements that exact morning. Stripped of her luxury vehicles and banned from her usual upscale cafes due to her frozen accounts, she sat entirely alone in a dingy, grease-stained diner on the industrial outskirts of the city. She wore a pair of oversized dark sunglasses in a pathetic attempt to hide her exhausted, swollen eyes. The investigator's encrypted report noted she was nursing a cheap cup of black coffee she could barely afford to purchase. Spread wide open on the sticky Formica table in front of her was a physical copy of the financial magazine. I stared at the digital image on my monitor, zooming in closely on her pale, horrified face. The agonizing realization was captured perfectly by the camera lens. She was reading the detailed, comprehensive breakdown of my billionaire status. She stared at the glossy photographs of my downtown penthouse and the extensive list of my global real estate assets. For 40 years, she had slept next to a man she considered a pathetic financial burden, completely oblivious to the fact that she was married to a legitimate titan of industry. She had aggressively traded a highly secure, quiet life with a billionaire for a toxic $3 million federal tax lien. The sheer gravity of her profound stupidity crushed her entirely. She clutched the edges of the glossy magazine, her knuckles turning stark white as she read the specific paragraph detailing my recent heavily publicized divorce. The article openly praised my strategic financial insulation, noting exactly how my ex-wife had voluntarily signed away all rights to my empire just hours before the federal government froze her fraudulent inheritance. Brenda slumped forward in the plastic diner booth, covering her face with her trembling hands. She had absolutely no one to blame but her own blinding arrogance. She had eagerly signed the legal waiver. She had proudly kicked me out of the house. She had enthusiastically embraced a financial guillotine while violently throwing away the golden key to an actual empire. The investigator reported that she sat frozen in that booth for 2 solid hours, completely paralyzed by the devastating weight of her colossal failure. Brenda's destruction was not limited to her rapidly decaying bank accounts. The ultimate punishment for a severe narcissist is the total unrecoverable loss of their public status. Desperate for a financial lifeline, she left the diner and drove her heavily financed, soon-to-be repossessed car directly to the exclusive suburban country club she had frequented for years using my invisible subsidies. She firmly believed she could leverage her long-standing social connections to secure a temporary loan or at least manipulate a sympathetic ear. She walked through the grand mahogany doors, expecting her usual wealthy associates to greet her with warm embraces and polite concern. Instead, she walked into a solid wall of absolute freezing silence. The magazine article had already circulated rapidly through the entire elite club membership. Every single person in the lavish dining room knew exactly what she had done. They knew she had arrogantly discarded a secret billionaire to inherit a massive unpayable federal debt. The wealthy elite do not tolerate profound financial stupidity. Brenda approached a table of affluent women she had previously considered her closest confidants. Before she could even pull out a wooden chair, the women stood up in perfect unison, gathered their expensive purses, and walked away without uttering a single word. They looked at her with overt, unapologetic disgust. The club manager approached Brenda moments later, discreetly handing her a formal printed letter of termination. He coldly informed her that her membership dues were severely delinquent, and the board of directors had voted unanimously to revoke her access to the facilities immediately. He ordered 2 security guards to escort her out of the dining room as dozens of prominent socialites openly mocked her pathetic public downfall. Brenda was publicly stripped of her fake crown and totally ostracized by the exact high society crowd she had spent decades desperately trying to impress. She was completely exiled from the wealthy suburban enclave, forced to return to the miserable squalor she had legally bound herself to. I closed the investigator's report on my monitor and leaned back in my comfortable leather chair. I had successfully dismantled every single pillar of her toxic existence, leaving her with absolutely nothing but the crushing, inescapable memory of the immense fortune she had foolishly thrown away. The towering glass and steel facade of the Vanguard Holdings corporate headquarters commanded the center of the downtown financial district. I stepped out of the private executive elevator and walked across the pristine marble lobby, flanked by two members of my personal security detail. Through the expansive revolving glass doors, I spotted a pathetic, shivering figure standing near the edge of the private corporate plaza. It was Brenda. She had clearly been waiting in the chilling evening wind for hours, entirely stripped of the haughty arrogance that had defined her for 4 decades. Her high society friends had abandoned her. The federal tax agents were actively seizing her assets, and the illusion of her multi-million-dollar inheritance was completely shattered. She bypassed the security perimeter the moment she saw me step onto the granite pavement. She ran forward, her high heels scraping clumsily against the stone. My security detail immediately stepped into her path, raising their hands to halt her frantic advance. I raised a single finger, instructing my guards to stand down and allow her to speak. Brenda stopped 3 feet away from me, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. She did not yell or demand obedience, as she had on the porch of our former home. She clasped her trembling hands together and began to weep, dropping her voice into a pathetic, pleading whimper. She begged for my forgiveness, desperately claiming she had been blinded by sudden grief and terrible legal advice. She swore she still loved me and pleaded for a chance to reconcile our marriage. The core of her desperate performance was entirely transparent. She was not begging for her husband. She was begging for a financial savior to write a $3 million check to the Internal Revenue Service and rescue her from absolute poverty. I stood perfectly still, letting her hollow apologies echo across the cold, empty plaza. I looked down at the weeping woman, clutching her hands in front of her chest. I felt absolutely no sympathy for the tears streaming down her pale face. I did not offer her a handkerchief or a comforting embrace. I maintained a posture of absolute, unyielding authority. I informed Brenda that I possessed a meticulous, infallible memory. I clearly recalled the exact moment she stood in our former hallway, proudly waving a signed divorce waiver in my face and commanding me to enjoy a miserable, impoverished pension. I reminded her of the brutal deposition where she blatantly lied under oath, attempting to frame me for severe psychological abuse, just to save her own skin. I told her that a sudden convenient apology, born entirely from the threat of a federal tax seizure, held zero value to me. Brenda dropped to her knees right there on the cold granite pavement, grabbing the hem of my tailored suit jacket, sobbing that she would do absolutely anything to fix her catastrophic mistake. I looked her dead in the eye and decided to test the actual depth of her supposed remorse. I presented her with a brutal, uncompromising ultimatum. I stated that if she truly wanted my financial protection and a total reconciliation, she had to completely surrender her ego to the legal system. I demanded she contact my attorney Robert and sign a comprehensive, legally binding public confession detailing her relentless financial abuse and her deliberate attempt to defraud the bankruptcy court. Furthermore, I required her to formally plead guilty to the felony perjury charges currently being drafted by the federal prosecutor. I demanded she serve the mandatory jail time associated with her criminal lies without requesting a single plea deal or a reduced sentence. I made it explicitly clear that she had to endure the total, public destruction of her reputation and face the harsh reality of a prison cell before I would even consider writing a single check to the Internal Revenue Service on her behalf. I demanded absolute, humiliating accountability. I told her this was the only viable path to salvation. She had to completely destroy the arrogant, toxic persona she had spent 40 years building before I would ever speak to her again. The harsh, uncompromising reality of my ultimatum slammed into Brenda like a physical blow. The pathetic, weeping facade instantly evaporated, replaced by the deep, ingrained vanity that had always been her true master. She slowly released her grip on my suit jacket and stood back up, her hands shaking with a renewed, indignant fury. The absolute horror of a public confession and the terrifying prospect of wearing a prison uniform completely overrode her fear of the federal tax agents. She refused to sacrifice her precious ego, even to save herself from lifelong poverty. She glared at me, her eyes flashing with venom, and shouted that I was a cruel, vindictive monster. She shrieked that she would rather die penniless in the street than publicly humiliate herself and sit in a filthy jail cell just to satisfy my twisted sense of justice. She firmly rejected the ultimatum, proudly declaring that she would somehow find a way to beat the federal audit and rebuild her life without my billionaire charity. She was choosing absolute financial annihilation over a single moment of genuine accountability. I watched her puff out her chest in a pathetic display of hollow defiance. I simply nodded my head, acknowledging her entirely predictable choice. I stated with cold precision that her blinding pride was the exact reason she had failed at every single juncture of this conflict. I told her that her arrogance had blinded her to the toxic reality of Uncle Garrison's estate, pushed her to sign the fatal divorce waiver, and ultimately forced her into a battle she lacked the intellect to win. She valued the false illusion of superiority over her own survival. I adjusted the cuffs of my suit jacket and turned my back on her completely. I did not waste another syllable on a woman who had willingly chosen her own destruction. I raised my hand and signaled my private security detail. The two heavily armed guards immediately stepped forward, flanking Brenda on both sides. I ordered them to physically remove her from the corporate plaza and to permanently ban her from approaching any property owned by Vanguard Holdings, LLC. I walked calmly toward my waiting town car, listening to the satisfying sound of Brenda screaming curses into the cold night air as the guards marched her away from my empire forever. The federal tax court was a cavernous room, built of dark mahogany and cold marble, perfectly designed to strip away the delusions of anyone who stood before the judge. I sat in the back row of the gallery, next to my attorney Robert, wearing a custom charcoal suit. I did not come to testify or participate. I came strictly as a silent spectator to witness the absolute finality of the trap Brenda had so eagerly sprung upon herself. Brenda sat at the defense table looking incredibly small and frail. Her heavily sanctioned bottom-tier attorney sat beside her completely defeated before the proceedings even began. The presiding federal judge, a man known for his merciless application of the tax code, adjusted his glasses and looked down from the high bench. He held the massive financial dossier detailing Uncle Garrison's fraudulent empire and the specific legal documents Brenda had aggressively filed to claim it. The judge did not mince words. He addressed the courtroom with a booming voice that echoed off the high ceiling. He stated clearly that ignorance of the law and blinding personal greed do not constitute a valid defense against federal tax evasion. He read directly from the expedited divorce waiver, explicitly citing Clause 7, where Brenda had voluntarily and permanently assumed all subsequent debts of her separate property to completely isolate her husband. He noted her recorded deposition where her own voice proved her aggressive intent to hoard the estate. The judge declared that the Internal Revenue Service had established an irrefutable claim against the defendant. He ruled that Brenda Hayes was the sole liable entity for the $3 million federal tax lion attached to Garrison's estate. He authorized the immediate and total liquidation of her personal assets to satisfy the government debt. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down onto the sounding block with a sharp, violent crack. That single sound signaled the absolute permanent end of Brenda's lavish illusion. She slumped forward onto the defense table, burying her face in her hands as the final ruling crushed the last breath from her lungs. The federal collection mandate was executed with terrifying speed and absolute lack of mercy. Within 24 hours of the judge's ruling, a fleet of government vehicles arrived at the suburban house Brenda had so proudly stolen from me. I monitored the entire sequence of events through the encrypted security feeds I still maintained on the perimeter of the property. Armed federal agents stepped out of their vehicles carrying empty cardboard boxes and formal seizure warrants. They did not knock politely. They breached the front door and immediately began the systematic dismantling of Brenda's life. Every single bank account bearing her name was instantly frozen and drained to a balance of absolute zero. The agents marched through the house, tagging every piece of furniture, every electronic device, and every remaining piece of jewelry that Megan had failed to steal. They marched directly into the master suite and began emptying the expansive walk-in closet. The expensive designer coats, the imported silk dresses, and the luxury shoes Brenda had purchased on high-interest credit just weeks prior were aggressively shoved into heavy plastic bags to be auctioned off by the state. Brenda stood on the front lawn, shivering in the cold morning air, wearing nothing but a cheap pair of sweatpants and a faded sweater. She watched in total agony as a heavy-duty tow truck backed into the driveway and hoisted her luxury SUV onto the flatbed. The government was legally stripping her down to her bare foundations. They handed her a single battered suitcase containing only the most basic essential clothing permitted by law. The lead agent locked the front door, secured a heavy steel padlock, and slapped a bright red federal seizure notice across the glass. Brenda was officially locked out of the house she had demanded I vacate. She possessed absolutely no cash, no credit, no transportation, and no shelter. She was left standing alone on the edge of the quiet suburban street, completely destitute. The affluent neighbors she had desperately tried to impress watched her from their windows, offering absolutely no assistance or sympathy. She picked up her suitcase and walked away, facing the exact miserable, impoverished life she had confidently ordered me to endure. While Brenda was being systematically erased from the suburban map her son was facing, his own absolute annihilation in a separate courtroom across the city. Derek sat in the federal bankruptcy court attempting to discharge the massive mountain of unsecured debt he had recklessly accumulated. He firmly believed the bankruptcy filing would offer him a clean slate, allowing him to wipe away the credit card bills and personal loans while desperately trying to restructure his home foreclosure. He fundamentally misunderstood the ruthless efficiency of Vanguard Holdings, LLC. My corporate attorneys represented the primary secured creditor, in his case holding the absolute legal right to the deed of his upscale property. Derek's appointed public defender attempted to argue for a lenient repayment plan, citing Derek's sudden loss of family support and his impending divorce from Megan. My legal team immediately objected. They presented the comprehensive financial logs demonstrating Derek's pattern of extreme financial negligence and his complete lack of viable income. They proved that he possessed absolutely no means to satisfy even the basic interest payments on the accelerated mortgage. The bankruptcy judge, a stern woman with no patience for entitled debtors, reviewed the corporate filings and sided entirely with my holding company. She rejected Derek's restructuring petition and authorized the immediate liquidation of his estate to satisfy the creditors. The judge signed the final orders that stripped Derek of his remaining assets. The bank immediately repossessed his 2 luxury leased vehicles, leaving him without any mode of transportation. The court granted Vanguard Holdings the formal writ of possession for his expansive home, authorizing the county sheriff to execute a forced physical eviction by the end of the day. Derek lost his cars, his home, and his entirely fabricated status as a successful upper-class professional. He was reduced to a bankrupt 34-year-old man with a ruined credit score and absolutely zero prospects. He walked out of the downtown courthouse carrying a single cardboard box containing his meager personal files. He had spent 5 years mocking my quiet lifestyle, firmly believing his shiny platinum cards made him superior. Now the invisible safety net was permanently gone, and he was tumbling rapidly into the harsh, unforgiving concrete of the real world. My son and my ex-wife were completely destroyed by their own synchronized greed. The fallout from the spectacular public arrests and absolute financial ruin generated a vicious shockwave of self-preservation. Megan was currently out on a minimal bail bond awaiting her impending felony grand larceny trial. She spent her first day of temporary freedom aggressively securing a ruthless divorce attorney, using funds she begged from a distant relative. She immediately filed for a highly publicized and incredibly messy divorce against my bankrupt son. She possessed absolutely no loyalty to Derek, now that his platinum credit cards and luxury home were permanently seized by Vanguard Holdings, LLC. She threw him completely under the proverbial bus in her legal filings. Megan crafted a wildly fabricated narrative, claiming Derek was a severely abusive partner who deliberately starved her of basic necessities. She explicitly blamed his profound financial incompetence for her criminal actions, arguing that he psychologically coerced her into breaking into Brenda's suburban home to steal the jewelry. She painted herself as a desperate and terrified housewife forced into felony theft simply to survive her husband's total collapse. Derek received the brutal divorce petition while sleeping on a stained mattress in a cheap hourly motel on the outskirts of the city. He had no legal representation, no money to fight her claims, and absolutely no defense against the woman who had happily helped him try to steal my assets just weeks prior. I read the detailed legal alerts forwarded by my attorney Robert while sitting comfortably in my downtown penthouse. Megan was desperately trying to use the divorce as a mitigating factor for her upcoming criminal sentencing, perfectly willing to destroy whatever was left of Derek's reputation to shave a few months off her inevitable prison term. Their marriage was entirely built on a foundation of unearned luxury and mutual parasitism. The very second the money evaporated, their toxic union instantly mutated into a violent and cannibalistic legal war. I drank my black coffee and closed the digital file, feeling absolutely zero pity for the son who had proudly ordered me to leave my own home without a single dime. The federal government operates with a cold and mechanical efficiency that leaves absolutely no room for human ego. The Internal Revenue Service completed the total liquidation of Brenda's seized assets by the end of the month. They auctioned off the suburban house, her luxury vehicles, and the designer wardrobe she had purchased on high-interest credit, applying the meager proceeds against the massive $3 million corporate tax lien. Brenda was left completely destitute, entirely stripped of the wealthy upper-class facade she had spent 4 decades obsessively maintaining. She was forced to rely on a minimal state assistance check just to survive. Stripped of her country club memberships and entirely ostracized by her former high society friends, she had absolutely no one to lean on. My private investigator provided a final and comprehensive report detailing her new residential address. Brenda had signed a strict month-to-month lease on a tiny and dilapidated studio apartment located in the most dangerous and neglected industrial sector of the city. The investigator included high-definition photographs of her new reality. The building featured peeling paint, flickering fluorescent hallway lights, and heavily barred windows. She possessed no marble countertops, no walk-in closets, and no private security detail. Her entire existence was now confined to a miserable 300-square-foot concrete box. She was forced to ride the crowded public transit bus system, to purchase off-brand groceries at discount liquidation stores, carefully counting her loose change at the register. The profound irony of her living situation was a masterpiece of absolute and inescapable justice. Just a few weeks ago, she had proudly stood in the foyer of our former home, clutching the signed divorce waiver, and mockingly ordered me to enjoy a pathetic and impoverished retirement. She had aggressively intended to cast me out into the street to live in squalor while she reigned over Uncle Garrison's fake empire. Now, by virtue of her own blinding arrogance and supreme greed, she was permanently trapped in the exact miserable existence she had gleefully designed for me. I looked at the photograph of Brenda carrying cheap plastic grocery bags up a cracked concrete stairwell. I permanently deleted the image from my secure server. She was officially a ghost of my past. The absolute destruction of the Hayes family hierarchy was finally complete. The toxic alliance that had aggressively conspired to strip me of my hidden wealth completely devoured itself from the inside out. Extreme poverty and looming criminal convictions act as a brutal magnifying glass, exposing the darkest elements of human nature. Brenda, Derek, and Megan did not band together to survive their synchronized downfall. Instead, they violently severed all remaining ties, turning into deeply isolated islands of pure resentment and hatred. Brenda entirely blamed Derek and Megan for her total ruin, furiously claiming they had manipulated her into confronting me, and then deliberately tried to rob her blind during her most vulnerable moment. She refused to answer Derek's desperate phone calls from his cheap motel, cutting off her only child without a single shred of maternal hesitation. Derek fiercely despised his mother for blindly accepting the toxic inheritance that triggered his mortgage acceleration, completely blaming her arrogance for the loss of his upscale suburban lifestyle. He equally loathed Megan for attempting to steal his last $62,000 and then publicly dragging his name through the mud in her vicious divorce filings. Megan hated both of them, cursing the entire family for dragging her into a miserable felony, grand larceny charge that would permanently destroy her future. They were utterly consumed by their synchronized greed, yet none of them possessed the basic intellectual capacity to take personal accountability for their own actions. They refused to acknowledge that their profound lack of respect and insatiable entitlement had triggered the avalanche that crushed them. They simply pointed fingers at each other, entirely trapped in a permanent cycle of bitter poverty and legal nightmares. I stood up from my desk and walked toward the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows of my luxury penthouse. I looked down at the vibrant and moving city, far below my private sanctuary. I had successfully executed a flawless defensive strategy, utilizing my forensic auditing expertise to perfectly reflect their malicious intentions back onto them. I had completely purged the infection from my life, without raising my voice or breaking a single law. The intense and draining conflict that had suffocated my existence for 4 decades was permanently extinguished. I was completely free from their parasitic grip, leaving them to burn in the ashes of the fake empire they had so desperately tried to steal. I sat at the center of my mahogany desk inside the quiet sanctuary of my penthouse command center. The city outside was still wrapped in the dark early hours of the morning, providing the perfect atmosphere for total focus. A thick stack of corporate restructuring documents, meticulously prepared by Robert, sat in front of me. I picked up my silver pen and began the methodical process of signing the final pages. These papers were not just administrative updates. They were the ultimate, impenetrable firewall designed to permanently secure my legacy against any future parasites. I legally transferred the entirety of Vanguard Holdings LLC along with my secondary investment portfolios and offshore assets directly into a blind, irrevocable trust. I established strict mathematically enforced criteria for any future board members, completely removing emotional leverage from the equation. I explicitly wrote Derek, Brenda, and Megan out of my estate by their full legal names. I included specific exclusionary clauses guaranteeing that no future lawsuit, no desperate appeal, and no sudden shift in probate law could ever grant them access to a single cent of my empire. They were now legally classified as absolute strangers to my bloodline and my wealth. Every signature I pressed onto the crisp parchment felt like driving a heavy steel bolt into the coffin of their greed. I had successfully insulated my fortune against anyone who might mistake my quiet demeanor for financial vulnerability. The ink dried quickly, permanently sealing a multi-billion-dollar empire behind flawless legal vault doors. My wealth would never be weaponized to diminish my worth again. I closed the heavy leather binder, feeling the satisfying weight of absolute control. The intense decades-long game of financial chess was officially over. I placed the binder inside my biometric floor safe and locked the heavy steel door. I stood up from my desk, leaving the quiet hum of my computer servers behind. I had spent 40 years silently enduring an environment of profound disrespect while carefully calculating my escape route. The meticulous, disciplined planning had yielded the perfect result. With my personal fortress fully secured, I turned my attention to the offensive strategy I had planned for the next chapter of my life. I walked over to the secondary monitor and initiated a massive pre-scheduled wire transfer. I officially seeded the Vanguard Justice Initiative with an initial endowment of $50 million. This foundation was not a traditional charity designed to hand out warm meals or polite advice. It was a highly aggressive, heavily armed legal defense fund, specifically structured to protect elderly individuals from familial financial abuse. I had witnessed firsthand how easily greedy children and entitled spouses attempt to weaponize the legal system to strip older adults of their autonomy and their assets. Derek and Brenda had tried to deploy those exact toxic tactics against me. They failed because I possessed the capital and the forensic expertise to crush them. Most victims do not have a private holding company or a ruthless attorney like Robert standing by their side. My foundation was created to be that exact weapon for the defenseless. I authorized the hiring of a dozen top-tier litigators, forensic accountants, and private investigators. Their sole corporate mandate was to hunt down financial parasites who preyed on vulnerable seniors. I directed the foundation to fully fund the legal battles of elderly victims, fighting forced guardianships, forged property transfers, and stolen retirement accounts. I wanted the foundation to systematically bankrupt the abusers through relentless litigation, exactly as I had done to my own toxic family. I reviewed the final press release prepared by my public relations team. It announced the launch of the initiative, emphasizing our zero-tolerance policy for elder exploitation. I approved the immediate distribution of the announcement to all major legal and financial media outlets. The foundation would provide an impenetrable shield for those who needed it most, ensuring that arrogant, greedy relatives faced swift, devastating consequences for their actions. I did not build this initiative out of a soft sense of pity. I built it to enforce absolute justice. Every dollar spent destroying a financial predator would serve as a permanent testament to the power of quiet, calculated retribution. I walked into my pristine modern kitchen and brewed a fresh cup of dark black coffee. The rich, bitter aroma grounded me in the reality of my absolute victory. I carried the steaming ceramic mug through the expansive living room and pushed open the heavy glass doors leading out to the penthouse balcony. The cool, crisp morning wind washed over my face as I stepped out onto the wide terrace. I walked to the edge of the glass railing and looked out over the sprawling city far below. The sky was just beginning to break, shifting from a deep bruised purple into a brilliant fiery orange. The urban landscape slowly woke up, thousands of tiny lights flickering off as the sun rose higher above the steel skyscrapers. I stood perfectly still, taking a slow, satisfying sip of my coffee. I listened to the distant muted hum of the morning traffic navigating the concrete canyons. For the first time in my adult life, my environment matched the profound silence in my mind. There were no arrogant demands echoing down the hallway. There were no entitled complaints about my modest wardrobe or my quiet disposition. There was no daughter-in-law plotting to steal my assets and no son expecting me to finance his reckless failures. I was completely unburdened, entirely stripped of the parasites that had fed on my patience for 40 years. Brenda was currently waking up in a miserable, dilapidated studio apartment, permanently chained to a federal tax debt she could never escape. Derek was facing the brutal reality of total bankruptcy and a vicious, humiliating divorce. They were trapped in the suffocating squalor they had so eagerly tried to force upon me. I felt absolutely no regret for the devastating sequence of events I had engineered. I had merely held up a mirror to their profound greed and allowed them to shatter themselves against it. I took another sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter taste and the absolute uncompromising power of my ultimate freedom. I watched the golden sunlight reflect off the towering glass buildings illuminating the vast empire I had built in the shadows. The long, exhausting war was finally over, and I remained the undisputed king of my own reality. The dust has finally settled over the ruins of a broken family. Looking back at the absolute devastation brought upon Brenda, Derek, and Megan, the most profound lesson learned is that true power never demands attention. True power observes, calculates, and acts with devastating precision. For 4 decades, I lived in a house filled with loud arrogance and deafening disrespect. My silence was repeatedly mistaken for weakness, and my modest demeanor was categorized as pathetic financial incompetence. They firmly believed that volume equated to strength and that cruelty was a privilege of the wealthy. They were entirely wrong about everything. The ultimate tragedy of their existence was their shared belief that money could buy superiority and insulate them from the consequences of their own malicious actions. They worshipped the superficial illusion of upper-class status, while completely ignoring the structural integrity of their actual lives. Greed is a blinding poison that rots the human soul from the inside out, stripping away logic, loyalty, and basic survival instincts. Brenda spent her entire life chasing an empty mirage. She desperately wanted to be perceived as a queen, viewing everyone around her as stepping stones to elevate her fake societal ranking completely forever. When Uncle Garrison and his toxic estate fell into her lap, she did not pause to examine the reality of the situation. She was so intoxicated by the mere concept of millions that she proudly threw away her husband, her stability, and her future. Her profound downfall teaches us that pride is the most expensive luxury a person can own. She traded a quiet, secure life with a secret billionaire for a suffocating federal tax lien simply because she lacked the humility to look beneath the surface. She judged the book entirely by its faded cover, eagerly burning everything down. She burned down her own sanctuary just to rule over a pile of ashes. Her punishment was not inflicted by my hands. It was the natural, inescapable harvest of the poisonous seeds she planted every single day. My son Derek represents the devastating failure of unearned privilege. His spectacular collapse in the downtown cafe serves as a brutal reminder that subsidizing arrogance only creates monsters. By removing the financial floor beneath his feet, I gave him the only gift that truly mattered: absolute accountability. He learned the agonizing lesson that respect cannot be bought with a platinum credit card, and that a marriage built on mutual parasitism will violently consume itself the moment the money disappears. Megan proved that loyalty tied to a bank account is merely a delayed betrayal waiting for the right moment to strike. They deserved each other perfectly in their absolute total ruin. The establishment of the Vanguard Justice Initiative is the final testament to the lessons extracted from this dark chapter. Financial abuse thrives in the shadows of familial trust. Predators disguise their greed as loving concern, using the sacred bonds of family to systematically strip elderly victims of their autonomy and their assets. We must remain eternally vigilant against such evil. We must recognize that shared blood does not guarantee a shared moral compass. Setting firm, uncompromising boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is an absolute necessity for survival. You must always protect your peace and your vital resources. You must secure your life with ironclad legal frameworks. Never allow emotional blackmail to dictate your financial security. The foundation now stands as an impenetrable shield for those who cannot fight back, turning my personal victory into a relentless crusade against elder exploitation. Justice is not a passive concept. It is a mechanism that must be actively and ruthlessly enforced. Ultimately, the greatest inheritance a person can possess is an unbreakable sense of self-respect. Money is merely a tool, completely devoid of morality or loyalty every single passing day. It amplifies the true nature of the person wielding it. In the hands of the greedy, it becomes a weapon of self-destruction. In the hands of the disciplined, it becomes an instrument of ultimate freedom. I walked away from a toxic marriage with my dignity completely intact and my empire fully secured. I chose to embrace the quiet, unyielding power of the truth. I learned that letting go of toxic people is not a loss, but a profound liberation. You do not owe your life to individuals who view your existence as a disposable resource to be drained endlessly. You owe it to yourself to cut the infection away and step forward boldly into the brilliant light of your own independence. The storm has passed, and I remain the undisputed king of my own reality. I hope my journey provides clarity and strength to anyone facing similar battles in their own lives. If this story resonated with your experiences, or if you have ever had to sever ties with toxic relatives to protect your peace, please share your thoughts in the comments section below. I am always curious to know where my audience is watching from right now today. So please mention your city or country directly. Your engagement helps spread this powerful message. We want to reach those who might desperately need to hear it today. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of resilient strategy and ultimate vindication. Share this video with friends who might find value in these important lessons. Stand firm in your truth, protect your boundaries, and never let anyone underestimate your worth. Thank you for your continued support on this channel. I look forward to seeing you in the next story. Stay vigilant always.